The voice cut through the frost-laced dawn like the edge of a skinning blade. Warren Hewitt stood in the doorway of the cabin, his frame blocking what little warmth the coming sun might have offered. His arms were crossed over his chest, his face carved from the same granite that jutted from the peaks beyond their small valley. "Abigail, get yourself out here." She woke to those words most mornings now, ever since her stepmother had brought her own daughters into this house 3 winters past. Ever since the fever had taken her real mother and left behind only a faded quilt and a leather-bound journal Abigail kept hidden beneath the floorboards near her sleeping pallet. The journal she'd never had the courage to open, because opening it meant facing the truth that her mother was gone, truly gone, and no amount of wishing would bring her back. Her eyes opened to the rough-hewn beams above her head. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and yesterday's venison stew, of unwashed wool and the sharp bite of winter that crept through every crack in the chink logs. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a rhythm she'd learned to recognize as the drumbeat of another day she would have to survive. Tobias Crawford's holding a gathering today. Warren's voice came flat, emotionless, the way a man might speak about butchering a pig or mending a broken axle. He spat into the dirt outside the door, the sound sharp and final. "Every trapper, hunter, and mountain man within 50 miles will be there. He's got 7 daughters of his own, plus the others from families who've pledged to participate. Any man who's proven himself worthy can choose a wife from among them. It's the old custom brought down from the first settlers who came through these mountains. The way we build strong families and country that kills the weak." He paused, and Abigail felt his eyes on her even through the thin curtain that separated her sleeping corner from the main room. She pulled the threadbare quilt higher, as if it could shield her from what was coming. "You'll go with your stepsisters, stand there with the rest of them, even though no man in these mountains would burden himself with you. But you'll go so folks don't say I kept you hidden like some shameful secret I'm trying to bury." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of pain through her chest. They always did. Abigail had learned to brace for them the way a person learns to brace for the crack of thunder after seeing lightning split the sky. It didn't make them hurt less, it just meant she knew they were coming. She curled her fingers into the quilt, wishing she could disappear into the mountain itself, become part of the stone and pine and snow that surrounded this valley. Wishing she could be anywhere but here, anyone but herself. Don't just lie there gawking like a stunned deer. The water barrel's near empty. Get down to the creek and haul it full. Gather wild onions while you're at it, if you can find any this late in the season. Might as well be useful, seeing as you'll never be wanted. His boots scraped across the wooden floor as he left, taking what little warmth the room had held with him. The door slammed shut, and Abigail heard him outside, his voice raised as he called to her stepmother, telling her to get the other girls ready, make sure they look presentable, not like some ragged camp followers. Abigail forced herself upright. Her sleeping pallet was pushed into the smallest corner of the cabin, wedged between the cold outer wall and the stone chimney that provided the only heat. The blanket beneath her was thin from years of use, the straw stuffing lumpy and uneven. She'd grown used to waking with her shoulders aching, her neck stiff from the way she had to curl herself to fit in the narrow space. She pulled on her worn buckskin dress, the leather strained across her shoulders and hips. She'd let it out twice already, with scraps she'd traded for at the settlement store, bartering the few coins she earned doing washing for the trappers' wives. But there was no more leather to spare, and the dress pulled tight in ways that made her cheeks burn with shame every time she stepped outside. Her reflection wavered in the small piece of broken mirror that hung on the wall, a fragment no bigger than her palm. Round face, tired eyes, cheeks already flushed with shame before the day had truly begun. She turned away quickly, unable to bear the sight of herself. Outside, the settlement was stirring to life. The valley where they lived was called Coldwater Basin, a collection of rough cabins and lean-tos scattered along the banks of a creek that ran icy and clear down from the peaks. 50 families, maybe 60 if you counted the trappers who came and went with the seasons. The smoke from breakfast fires rose into the cold air, gray pillars against the dawn-pink sky. Horses whinnied in their corrals. Men called to one another, their voices carrying sharp and clear across the frozen ground. And with those voices came the whispers. Abigail heard them as she stepped out of the cabin, wooden bucket in hand. She heard them even when the words weren't spoken aloud, because she'd learned to read the sideways glances, the smirks that people tried to hide behind their hands, the way conversations stopped when she walked past. There goes Warren's girl, the big one. Poor thing. Crawford's gathering won't change her fortune. No mountain man in his right mind would take that burden on. Not with 7 of Crawford's daughters and a dozen others standing right beside her. She kept her eyes fixed on the rocky path ahead. The bucket knocked against her leg with each step, the wood smooth from years of use. She walked faster, trying to outpace the words that clung to her like burrs in wool. If she could just reach the creek quickly, fill the bucket, and return before the whole settlement woke fully, before the gathering preparations began in earnest, and everyone would see her walking into Crawford's place with her stepsisters, each step a reminder of how she didn't belong. A small cry stopped her cold. She turned her head, careful not to meet anyone's eyes directly. Near the trading post, a little girl sat in the dirt, no more than 5 years old, clutching her arm. Her face was streaked with tears, small shoulders shaking. Trappers and their wives passed by without slowing. A few glanced down, shook their heads, kept walking. Nobody stopped. The child's mother was probably inside the post, bartering for supplies, unaware her daughter had fallen. Abigail hesitated. She knew what the whispers would say if she knelt there in the open, if she showed her soft heart again. Soft hearts had no place in this hard land, her father had told her more times than she could count. Soft hearts got you hurt, got you killed, got you nothing but mockery from folks who knew better. But her feet carried her forward anyway. She crouched beside the child, her voice gentle as spring snow melting on pine branches. "Hush now, little one. Let me see what's troubling you." The girl sniffled, lifting her scraped elbow. Dirt and blood mixed in the shallow cut. Nothing serious, but enough to scare a small child. Abigail tore a strip from the corner of her shawl, the same wool shawl she'd already mended a dozen times, and dabbed carefully at the wound. "You're brave as any mountain cat. See? Nothing that won't heal clean." The girl's tears slowed. Her lip trembled, then curved into the smallest smile. "Thank you, miss." Abigail smiled back, though her own eyes burned with unshed tears. She gave the child's hair a gentle pat, then rose to her feet, her knees aching from the cold ground. Across the path, a cluster of women stood near the provision store. Their voices carried clear as the creek water. "Always fussing over strays, that one. Strange girl, too tender for these mountains. Those feelings will get her killed one winter. Probably thinks kindness will make her pretty." Their laughter followed her like smoke from a dying fire. Abigail pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did nothing to warm the cold that had settled in her chest. The little girl's smile lingered in her mind like a candle flame in wind, fragile and precious, but it wasn't enough to warm her against the chill of those stairs. The creek came into view through the pines, the water running fast and clear over smooth stones. Several young women clustered nearby, filling their own buckets, their dresses clean leather and homespun cotton, their hair braided neat with ribbons and beadwork. They laughed easily, practicing smiles they'd wear for the men who might claim them at the gathering. Their voices were bright with nervous hope, the kind of hope Abigail had stopped allowing herself years ago. She recognized them. The Miller twins, with their matching blonde braids, Sarah Pritchard, with her carefully embroidered collar, Emma Stone, who could sing like a mockingbird and knew it. They fell silent when they saw her approaching, their eyes sliding away, their conversation dying mid-sentence. Abigail lowered her gaze and knelt by the water's edge, away from the others. She dipped her bucket in, watching her reflection ripple and distort on the surface. Round face, tired eyes, cheeks already flushed with shame. Her father's words echoed in the hollow chamber of her heart. "No man would burden himself with you." She gripped the bucket handle and whispered into the mountain air, too quiet for anyone else to hear. "Let it be over quickly. Please just let today be over." The bucket filled with cold, clear water. She lifted it with trembling arms, the weight pulling at her shoulders. The path back to the cabin seemed longer than usual, each step carrying the weight of dread. She could see other families preparing already, mothers brushing their daughters' hair on porches, fathers checking rifles and adjusting their best leather vests. The whole settlement buzzed with nervous energy. This gathering wasn't just about marriages. It was about survival, about building families strong enough to endure the brutal mountain winters, about ensuring the settlement would continue to grow rather than wither away like so many others had. Abigail understood the importance. She'd grown up hearing the stories of settlements that failed, of families who couldn't make it through the long snows, of children who died from fever or starvation or cold. She just never imagined she'd be part of this particular ritual. Never imagined any man would look at her twice, let alone choose her as a wife. Inside the cabin, chaos reigned. Her stepmother, Constance, barked orders at her three daughters, pulling out their best dresses, tying ribbons, smoothing wrinkles with frantic hands. The girls ranged in age from 16 to 22, Margaret, Catherine, and young Louisa with hair like corn silk. They shared their mother's sharp features and sharper tongues, though Louisa sometimes looked at Abigail with something that might have been pity if you squinted hard enough. "You too, Abigail." Warren's voice cut through the noise. He stood near the hearth, cleaning his rifle, not looking at her. "You'll stand with them. I won't have folks saying I kept you hidden away like a secret shame. But Father, I could stay and tend them." His glare silenced her. The muscle in his jaw twitched, the way it always did when his anger was rising. "You'll stand there. You'll hold your head up. You hear me?" She lowered her eyes. "Yes, sir." Constance thrust a dress at her, dark blue homespun with leather trim. It was better than her everyday buckskin, but it still clung in ways that made Abigail's stomach turn. "At least try to look respectable," the woman muttered, her eyes already moving past Abigail to fuss over Margaret's hair. Abigail changed behind the thin curtain that separated her sleeping corner, her hands trembling as she tied the leather laces. Through the gaps in the cabin logs, she could see the settlement transforming. Men gathered in clusters, checking their horses, their weapons, their best furs. Women adjusted their daughters' clothing one final time. The air hummed with anticipation and barely contained tension. The gathering place was an hour's walk from their cabin, at the far end of the valley where Tobias Crawford had built his homestead against the base of the mountain. Crawford was the oldest settler in the basin, a man who'd been trapping and hunting these peaks since before Abigail was born. His wife had died bearing their seventh daughter, and he'd raised all 7 girls alone with the help of neighboring women. Now those daughters were grown, and Crawford had declared this gathering to ensure not just their futures, but the future of the entire settlement. By the time Abigail and her family reached Crawford's place, the crowd had swelled to nearly 200 people. Wagons circled the central clearing. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath steaming in the cold air. The noise was overwhelming, voices overlapping, men bartering pelts and rifles, women preparing food, children weaving between adults' legs. The smell of roasting meat mixed with wood smoke and the sharp scent of pine sap. Abigail kept her shawl pulled tight, hoping to blend into the crowd. She never did. A voice called out from near one of the wagons. "Look, Warren brought his big girl after all." She felt it before she turned, eyes on her. Laughter rising like steam from a kettle. 3 young trappers leaned against a wagon, grins wide as bear traps. She recognized them. James Hutchins, Daniel Cooper, and Thomas Reed, all in their mid-20s, all known for their cruel humor and their skill with a rifle in equal measure. "Dance for us, Abigail. Show us how light you are on your feet." The others howled with laughter. Abigail froze, heat flooding her face. Her basket of gathered roots, the ones she collected on the way, suddenly felt unbearably heavy in her hands. "Please, leave me be." Her voice came out as barely a whisper, swallowed by the noise around them. They circled closer, boots kicking up dust. "You're built for hauling, not dancing. Careful, boys. She might crack the earth itself if she tries to jump." One of them clapped his hands in rhythm, mocking a dance beat. "Come on, Abigail, give us a show." She shifted her foot to step past them, her skirt tangled in her own legs. She stumbled, arms flailing. The basket tipped. Wild onions and roots scattered across the dirt like stones thrown into water. The crowd erupted. Men with rifles, women with baskets, even children pointing and giggling. The laughter swelled like a river in spring flood, drowning everything else. Abigail dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the scattered food, her vision blurred. Her hand shook. Why was I born this way? The words slipped out before she could stop them, lost beneath the noise. Her throat burned. She wanted to disappear into the forest, to climb up into the high peaks where no one would ever see her again, where the cold would take her, and at least then she'd be free of this shame. She gathered the last onion, rose with her basket clutched to her chest, shawl pulled over her face to hide the tears that she couldn't stop anymore. Behind her, the trappers called out, "Dance again, Abigail? That was the finest jig we've seen all year." Their jeers chased her through the gathering. Each step grew heavier. Her heart pounded against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She slipped behind a supply wagon, away from the noise and eyes, and only then did the tears fall freely. She leaned against the rough wood, breath coming in shaky gasps, hugging her basket close as if it could shield her from the world. Alone and hidden, she whispered to the mountain wind, "Is there any place in this world for me?" No answer came, only distant laughter and the cry of a hawk circling high above the valley. She stayed there for long minutes, trying to compose herself, trying to find the strength to face what was coming. The gathering, the lineup, the rejection she knew would follow. Through a gap in the wagon boards, she could see families arriving. The Hales with their 3 daughters, the Sawyers with their twin girls known for their beautiful singing voices, the Parkers, the Mitchells, the Stones, all bringing their unmarried daughters, all dressed in their finest, all hopeful. And then there was Tobias Crawford's family. 7 daughters, each one different, each one valuable in her own way. That's what people said anyway. Abigail wasn't a Crawford daughter. She was here because Warren had remarried, because Constance was distant kin to the Crawfords, because it would look strange if the stepdaughter stood on that platform, and Warren's own flesh and blood didn't. So she would stand, and she would endure, because that's all she'd ever known how to do. The gathering bell rang out just past noon, its sharp clang echoing across the valley, bouncing off rock faces and pine stands. Abigail flinched at the sound. Tobias Crawford stepped onto the raised platform near his cabin, a rough structure of hewn logs that stood about 4 feet off the ground. The old trapper's voice boomed across the crowd like thunder before a storm. "By the custom of these mountains," he called, "I've gathered you here today. The old ways, the ways of our fathers and their fathers before them. We build strong families in hard country, and we do it through this gathering. I've got 7 daughters of my own, all of marriageable age. Plus there's a dozen more from families who've chosen to participate. Any man among you who's proven himself worthy, who can trap and hunt and survive these peaks through winter, may choose himself a bride this day." A hush fell over the crowd, then whispers spread like wildfire through dry grass. 7 Crawford daughters to choose from. Lord have mercy, which one would you take? Did you see the pretty one with the dark braids? That's Eleanor, the eldest. Women clutched their daughters closer, fathers straightened, assessing the men in the crowd with calculating eyes. Baskets were set down, rifles leaned against wagons, bread ovens left unattended. Inside Crawford's cabin, the chaos reached a fever pitch. Girls lined up near the door, waiting for their turn to step onto the platform. Mothers and aunts rushed about, pulling hair ribbons tighter, smoothing imaginary wrinkles, whispering last-minute instructions. "You too, Abigail." Warren's voice was sharp enough to cut. He stood near the cabin door, his face hard as the granite peaks. "You'll stand with them. I won't have folks saying I kept you hidden away." But Father, she couldn't finish, couldn't find the words to explain that standing there would only make it worse, would only give everyone another chance to laugh at her own. His glare was answer enough. Constance thrust the blue dress at her one more time, as if checking to make sure it was still presentable, then shook her head. "At least try to look respectable, girl, though I don't know why we're bothering." As Abigail smoothed the dress over her hips, her stepsisters filed past. Margaret first, tall and proud with her auburn hair braided in an intricate pattern. Then Catherine with her carefully embroidered collar. Finally Louisa, who paused for just a moment to give Abigail a small, almost kind smile before following her sisters outside. That small gesture made Abigail's throat ache. Kindness was so rare here, so unexpected, that even the smallest amount felt like water in a desert. The door opened. Mountain sunlight spilled over the threshold, bright and merciless. Each step down from the cabin felt heavier than the last. The gathering place ahead buzzed with anticipation. Horses stamping, men's voices raised in speculation and banter, the scrape of boots on rock, the rustle of fabric as women adjusted their shawls against the cold wind that had started blowing down from the peaks. Eyes followed Abigail as she walked slowly toward the platform, some pitying, some scornful, many laughing behind their hands. She's standing with them? Can you imagine? Look at her trying to hold her head up like she belongs there. Poor Warren. What did he do to deserve this? The walk felt endless, each step an eternity. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden, like carrying water barrels uphill through snow. The gathering ground hummed with noise and tension. Dust rose under wagon wheels and boot heels. Fathers positioned their daughters with the careful attention of men arranging valuable goods for auction. Mountain men clustered in groups, eyeing the women the way they'd eye good horseflesh or prime beaver pelts. At the platform, 19 young women lined up in a row. Crawford's 7 daughters stood in the center, flanked by the others on either side. Abigail's stepsisters took their places near the left end. Abigail moved to stand at the very far edge of the line, as far from the center as possible. The crowd rippled with fresh whispers. There she goes, taking up space she's got no right to, standing proud like she's got a chance. She'll be left standing when it's done. Mark my words. Abigail kept her eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath her feet, but she felt her father's glare from the crowd, pinning her in place, demanding she not run, not shame him further by showing weakness. So she stood, hands clasped in front of her, head bowed, and waited. Tobias Crawford climbed onto the platform, his boots loud on the wood. Several armed men stood behind him, his 2 eldest sons and a handful of respected hunters who would ensure order was kept and the custom was honored. Crawford's weathered face was stern as granite, his beard gray and untrimmed, his eyes sharp despite his 60-some years. By the custom of these mountains, he called out again, these women stand here today. Men of this territory will make their choices. No woman is excused. No man leaves here without the opportunity to choose a bride. This is how we build strong families in hard country. This is how we survive. The words crashed over the gathering like an avalanche. Fathers clutched daughters tighter. Girls whispered to each other, some smiling nervously, others pale with fear. Abigail's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. The dress pulled at her shoulders. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the mountain chill. She'd already heard in her mind the laughter that would come. The trapper's mocking chant echoed. Dance, Abigail, dance. Beside her, young Louisa glanced over with another small smile, this one tinged with sadness, as if she knew what was coming and wished it could be different. The kindness made Abigail's throat ache even more. Crawford raised his weathered hand. Men of the territory, step forward. Make your choice known. The gathering roared to life. Boots scraped dirt. Men pushed forward, jostling for position. Girls straightened, trying to look their best. Abigail kept her head bowed. Dust swirled at her feet. Her heart begged for this moment to end, for the earth to open and swallow her whole. But there was no escape. The choosing had begun. Crawford's boots struck the platform hard as he scanned the crowd. His eyes landed on a figure at the back, taller than the rest, standing apart from the other men. Bring him forward. Heads turned as the crowd parted like water before the prow of a boat. A massive man emerged, broad-shouldered and weather-worn, dressed in worn buckskin and furs that had seen many seasons. He stood taller than any other man present, easily 6.5 feet, his shoulders so wide they seemed to block out the sun. His face was hidden partially by a thick beard, but his eyes were visible, pale gray. Like winter skype on instantly irritable, whispers rippled through the crowd. That's Silas Thorne, the mountain man, lives alone up in the high country, hasn't been down to the settlement in near 2 years. They say he went up there after his wife died. Tragic thing that was. She was so young. Abigail dared to lift her eyes slightly, just enough to see him. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who feared nothing and needed no one. His buckskin clothing was well made but worn, patched in places but clean. A rifle was slung across his back, A knife hung at his belt. His hands were scarred and calloused from years of hard work. Crawford pointed at him. You've proven yourself in these mountains, Silas Thorne. Survived winters that killed lesser men. Lived through that avalanche 2 seasons back that took the Morrison cabin. You've earned the right to choose first. Pick yourself a wife. A ripple of excitement ran through the gathering. Mothers nudged their daughters forward. Fathers straightened with pride. Every girl on the platform held her breath, hope flickering in their eyes despite their fear. Even Abigail felt her heart skip, though she knew better than to hope for anything. The mountain man's jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice came out rough from disuse, like rusty iron scraping against stone. I came to trade pelts, not take a wife. Crawford's weathered face hardened. His eyes narrowed. Every man here will choose. These mountains need strong families. The custom demands it. You'll do your duty. I owe no custom my heart. Gasps spread through the crowd like wind through aspens. Some men smirked, eager for confrontation. Others shifted uncomfortably. The tension in the air thickened like smoke from green wood. Crawford stepped closer, barely reaching the bigger man's shoulder. Don't mistake yourself for above this, son. Today, every able man chooses. That's the law of this gathering. That's the law of this settlement. If you want to trade here, if you want to winter here when the deep snows come and you can't make it back to your high cabin, you'll honor our ways. Silas Thorne's eyes swept over the trembling women on the platform, 19 pairs of eyes watching him with varying degrees of hope and fear. Then his gaze returned to Crawford. I will not. The refusal cracked like a gunshot. Uneasy murmurs rose from the crowd, building like water behind a dam. Men muttered to each other. Women whispered behind their hands. Children sensed the tension and fell silent. Crawford raised his hand for silence. The crowd obeyed, but barely, the whispers dying to a low hiss. Refuse me here, Crawford said, his voice carrying across the gathering. And you'll answer to more than whispers. You'll answer to every man who follows custom while you spit on it. You'll be banned from this settlement, from trading here, from sheltering here when winter comes. You'll be alone up there in those peaks with no help if things go wrong. Silas stood unmoved, arms crossed over his broad chest, a wall of muscle and defiance. His expression didn't change. His eyes didn't waver. This isn't about what you want, Crawford pressed, stepping even closer. It's about duty, about building something that lasts. If the strongest man among us refuses, what hope do the rest have? What message does that send? The silence stretched like a bowstring pulled taut, on the verge of snapping. Mothers clutched children. Men leaned forward, hungry for drama, for violence, for something to break the unbearable tension. The 19 women on the platform barely dared to breathe. Finally, Silas shook his head, slow and final. I didn't come for this. Crawford's eyes narrowed to slits. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. You'll find, Silas Thorne, that no one leaves here without honoring our ways. Not even you. Even she stands here with courage. His weathered hands shot out, pointing directly at Abigail. Every head turned. Dozens of eyes locked onto her like rifle sights. Time seemed to slow. Abigail felt her stomach drop, felt her breath catch in her throat. No, please, no. A ripple of laughter rolled through the crowd, building into a wave that crashed over her from all sides. She actually thinks someone will choose her. Look at her standing there. Poor thing. Her dress can barely contain her. Another voice, loud and cruel, cutting through the rest. Mountain man, if you're being forced to choose, why not take her? She's been waiting her whole life for someone like you. The words struck like physical blows. Abigail's shoulders trembled. Every muscle locked tight. She stared at the platform boards, wishing she could sink through them, through the earth, down into some dark place where no one would ever see her again. Her cheeks burned so hot, she thought her skin might blister. The jeers grew louder, feeding on each other like fire catching in dry timber. Go on, big man. Make her day. She'll think she's dreaming. Better her than my daughter. At least she'll keep you warm in winter. The voices crashed over her like creek water in spring flood, drowning her, suffocating her. Her throat closed, tears pressed against her eyes, threatening to spill. She blinked hard, fighting them back with everything she had, refusing to cry in front of these people again, refusing to give them that satisfaction. Crawford's eyes narrowed at Silas, his voice cutting through the laughter. You see, even her, the one they all mock, she stands here braver than most men I know. What excuse have you left, son? Silas's jaw tightened. He didn't move, didn't speak. The silence stretched, long and heavy as winter nights. Abigail felt every second like a blade drawn slowly across her skin. One thought echoed in her mind, desperate and broken. Please just let this end. I can't stand here any longer. Please. Crawford folded his arms, satisfaction already creeping across his weathered face. He thought he'd won, thought he'd backed Silas into a corner from which there was no escape. What say you, mountain man? Will you honor the custom or shame us all? Silas's eyes swept across the line of women one more time. Margaret with her auburn hair, Catherine with her embroidered collar, Eleanor Crawford with her dark braids, Sarah Pritchard, Emma Stone, the Miller twins, all of them pretty in their ribbons and clean dresses, all of them hopeful, all of them everything Abigail was not. Then his gaze landed on her, on the girl at the end of the line, head bowed, shoulders shaking, tears she was desperately trying to hide. Abigail's stomach dropped. Her head bowed even lower, strands of dark hair falling across her face like a curtain. She braced herself for the final humiliation, for him to turn away, for Crawford to declare her unchosen, unwanted, exactly as everyone always said she'd be. She braced herself to walk back through that crowd alone while the other women were claimed one by one, to return to her father's cabin in shame, to spend the rest of her life as the girl no one wanted. All eyes were on Silas Thorne. The gathering held its breath. The mountain wind itself seemed to pause. Crawford waited, arms crossed, satisfaction already settling across his face. Finally, Silas lifted his chin. His voice came out steady and clear as a bell in thin mountain air, carrying across the gathering with an authority that silenced every whisper. Her. I choose her. The words cut through the gathering like an axe through pine. Silence descended, complete and total, as if every creature in the valley had stopped breathing. The wind itself seemed to hold still, waiting. Then the laughter erupted, louder than before, rolling across the crowd like an avalanche tearing down a mountainside. Men doubled over, slapping their knees. Women covered their mouths, but their eyes danced with cruel amusement. Even some of the other girls on the platform let out nervous giggles, quickly stifled, but there nonetheless. Did he say her? Out of 19 women, he picked that one. Man's addled from too many winters alone. Poor fool doesn't know what he's done to himself. He'll regret it by first snow. Mark my words. Abigail's heart stopped. The world tilted beneath her feet. Her breath caught somewhere in her throat. Unable to move up or down, her hands trembled at her sides, fingers curling into fists. She dared not look up. Couldn't. Not now. Not with every eye burning into her with mockery and disbelief. She was the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. The joke made flesh, the punchline to a cruel story she'd never asked to be part of. Crawford raised his bushy eyebrows, half amused, half satisfied that the standoff had ended regardless of how. So be it. The choice is made. Let it be witnessed by all gathered here. Silas Thorne has spoken his claim. He struck his boot against the wooden platform with a heavy stamp, sealing the decision like wax on a letter. The sound echoed across the valley, final and irrevocable. The laughter didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. Men slapped each other's backs. Women shook their heads in disbelief. Children pointed and whispered, not understanding why but knowing something funny had happened because the adults were laughing. Abigail's father turned his back on the platform, covering his face with one weathered hand. That sight pierced deeper than every cruel word the crowd had hurled. She felt small, exposed, ashamed in ways she'd never imagined possible. 100 voices drowned out everything else, including the one small voice inside her that whispered, Why me, Papa? Silas stood tall, unmoved. He didn't smile, didn't defend his choice, didn't explain himself to anyone. He simply stood by what he'd said, solid as the peaks themselves, waiting for Crawford to complete whatever ritual came next. The crowd kept cheering, waiting for him to crack, to laugh, to admit it was all a jest. But he didn't. And somehow that silence, that absolute refusal to engage with their mockery, unsettled them more than any words could have. Crawford motioned toward the rough-hewn chapel at the edge of the gathering, little more than a lean-to with a cross nailed above the entrance. It's done then. Let it be recorded. Silas Thorne has chosen Abigail Hewitt as his wife. By custom and law, they're bound. No one cheered, no one clapped. The only sound was cruel laughter that refused to die, echoing off the mountain walls, bouncing back from the pine forest, filling the valley with mockery. Abigail wiped at her tears, though it was useless. Her vision blurred. Her thoughts spiraled like autumn leaves in wind. What game is this? Why would he do this? To mock me further? To humiliate me before everyone and then cast me aside once we're alone? Crawford stepped down from the platform, gesturing for Silas and Abigail to follow. The ceremony would be brief, as was the mountain custom. A few words spoken, names recorded in the settlement ledger, and it would be finished. No celebration, no feast, just the cold legal binding, and then they would go their separate way. Or rather, she would go with him to whatever fate he'd chosen for her. Silas finally moved, taking one step toward the platform where Abigail stood frozen. The crowd parted for him, still laughing, still whispering. He reached the edge of the platform and extended his hand. Abigail stared at that hand. It was large, scarred from years of trapping and hunting, the knuckles rough and calloused. She couldn't bring herself to take it, couldn't bring herself to move at all. He didn't lower his hand, didn't speak. Just waited with the same patience he'd shown throughout this entire ordeal. Finally, her body moved of its own accord. Her hand lifted, trembling, and placed itself in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm despite the cold air, steady despite her shaking. He helped her down from the platform. His touch was gentle, careful, as if she might break. That small kindness made her throat ache even more. They walked together toward the chapel, the crowd following at a distance, still laughing, still speculating. Abigail kept her eyes on the ground, counting each step like prayers. 1, 2, 3, 4, each one taking her further from her old life and closer to whatever this new existence would be. Inside the chapel, a traveling preacher waited. He was a thin man with kind eyes who'd arrived in the valley 2 days prior, timing his visit to coincide with the gathering as he did every year. He looked between Silas and Abigail, his expression carefully neutral, though surprise flickered briefly across his face. Your names, Silas Thorne, Abigail Hewitt. The preacher opened his worn leather Bible, the pages yellowed and soft from years of use. He spoke the words quickly, perhaps sensing that neither of them wanted this moment to last longer than necessary. By the authority granted me and witnessed by this gathering, I bind you in marriage according to the laws of God and this territory. He produced a leather-bound ledger, the settlement's official record, and wrote their names with careful script. Silas signed with a firm hand. Abigail's signature came out shaky, the letters barely legible. It is done. 3 words. That's all it took to change everything. They emerged from the chapel into the afternoon sun. The crowd had grown, if anything. More people had arrived late to the gathering and were now being filled in on what they'd missed. Fresh laughter erupted as the story spread. Wait, he chose the big girl? Truly? Must be mad, or blind, or both. Give him a week and he'll come crawling back, begging Crawford to annul it. Silas ignored them all. He walked toward the edge of the gathering where a large gray horse stood tied to a pine tree. The animal was massive, built for carrying heavy loads through deep snow. Its saddle was well-worn but well-maintained. He untied the horse and turned to Abigail. Can you ride? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. No, his response was a simple nod, as if he'd expected as much. He swung himself into the saddle with easy grace, then extended his hand again. Abigail stared at it, at him, at the horse that seemed impossibly tall. I've got you. Those 3 words, spoken quietly enough that only she could hear, held more reassurance than any lengthy speech could have. She placed her hand in his again and let him pull her up. She landed awkwardly behind him, her arms instinctively wrapping around his waist to keep from falling. She could feel the solid muscle beneath his buckskin shirt, could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. Hold tight. The horse moved forward at a walk, carrying them away from the gathering. Behind them, the laughter continued. Fresh jeers followed them down the trail. Look at her clinging to him like a burr. She'll pull him right off that horse if she's not careful. Better you than me, Thorn. Abigail closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against Silas's back, trying to shut out the voices. Her whole body trembled with humiliation and confusion and fear. She wanted to ask him why, wanted to demand an explanation, wanted to scream or cry or do anything other than just accept this bizarre turn her life had taken, but fear held her tongue captive. What could she possibly say? What words could make sense of this? The trail climbed steeply into the mountains, following the creek upstream. The voices faded behind them, swallowed by distance and the sound of rushing water. Pine trees closed in on either side, their branches heavy with the promise of coming snow. The air grew thinner, colder, cleaner with each passing minute. They rode in silence for over an hour. The horse picked its way carefully over rocks and roots, never stumbling, responding to the slightest pressure from Silas's knees. Abigail had never been this far from the settlement. Her father's cabin sat at the lower end of the valley, and she'd rarely ventured beyond the creek in the trading post. This was wild country, the kind of wilderness that swallowed people whole if they weren't careful. A deer bounded away through the underbrush, white tail flashing. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing and lonely. The sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The beauty of it all would have taken Abigail's breath away if she'd had any breath left to take. Finally, as twilight began to gather in the shadows between the trees, a cabin came into view. It was tucked against the mountainside, surrounded by tall pines, built from massive logs that must have taken years to cut and haul into place. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. A small garden plot, now harvested for winter, sat to one side. A chicken coop stood behind the cabin, and Abigail could hear the soft clucking of hens settling for the night. It was isolated, far from any other dwelling, but it was solid, well built, the kind of place that could withstand the brutal mountain winters. Silas dismounted first, then helped her down. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet hit the ground. She'd never ridden for so long, and every muscle protested. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow until she found her balance. He led the horse to a small stable beside the cabin, removed the saddle, and brushed the animal down with practiced efficiency. Abigail stood uncertainly near the cabin door, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, unsure what she was supposed to do. When he finished with the horse, Silas walked past her and opened the cabin door. The interior was dim, but he lit a lamp with a flint strike, and warm light spilled across the space. The cabin was simple but well-maintained. Sturdy log walls chinked with moss and clay. Pelts hanging from the rafters. Fox, beaver, elk, wolf. A table carved from a single massive piece of pine. 2 chairs, a stone hearth with a fire already laid, waiting to be lit. Shelves lined with supplies, flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. A loft above, accessible by a rough ladder where she could see a sleeping pallet. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone and needed no one. Every object had its place. Every tool was clean and ready. There was no clutter, no waste, no softness. And now she was here, an unwanted burden in his solitary world. Silas moved with calm, practiced efficiency. He set his rifle above the door, poured himself water from a barrel, stoked the fire in the hearth until flames licked at the logs and heat began to fill the space. Not a single word for her, not one glance. Abigail lingered near the door, fingers twisting nervously in her shawl. Her body trembled with exhaustion and something deeper, a bone-deep shame that made her want to curl up and disappear. The cabin was warm, but she felt cold inside, frozen in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Finally, she found her voice, though it came out small and broken. "Why did you choose me?" Silas paused in his work. His back was to her, his shoulders broad beneath his buckskin shirt. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then, without turning, "Because you needed someone to." The words hung in the air between them. They weren't romantic, weren't flowery. They were simple statement of fact, and somehow that made them cut even deeper. Tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks. She pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All day she'd held them back, refused to cry in front of the crowd, refused to give them that satisfaction. But here, alone with this stranger who'd inexplicably bound himself to her, the dam finally broke. She slipped into a corner near the hearth and sat on a small bench there. The warmth from the fire touched her skin, but couldn't reach the cold inside. The tears she'd held back all day poured freely now. Years of shame and loneliness and pain spilling out in great shuddering sobs. I've ruined your life. Just like my father always said, I ruin everything. They were all right about me. I don't belong anywhere. Not in the settlement. Not here. Nowhere. The log walls absorbed her broken words, holding them like secrets no one else would ever hear. Silas finally turned. He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable in the firelight. Then he moved to the shelves, took down a tin cup and filled it with water from the barrel. He crossed to where she sat and held it out. Drink. She took the cup with shaking hands, surprised by the gesture. The water was cold and clean, straight from the mountain spring. It soothed her raw throat. He returned to the fire and began preparing a simple meal. Dried venison, hard bread, beans from a jar. The domesticity of it was jarring after everything that had happened. He moved like he'd done this 1,000 times before, which he probably had, living alone up here for 2 years. Abigail watched through her tears, trying to understand this man, this stranger who was now her husband. He was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Why would someone like him, strong, capable, clearly able to survive alone, choose her? Especially when he'd made it clear he didn't want to choose anyone at all. The meal finished cooking. Silas divided it onto 2 plates and set one on the small table. He gestured to one of the chairs. Eat. She rose on unsteady legs and sat. The food was simple but well prepared. She forced herself to take small bites, though her stomach was in knots. Silas sat across from her, watched in silence. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the wind in the pines outside. After they finished, he collected the plates and washed them in a bucket of water near the door. Then he pointed to the loft above. You'll sleep there. I'll take the bench by the fire. Abigail's eyes widened. But this is your home. I can't take your bed. You can and you will. The words were firm but not unkind. She didn't argue, didn't have the energy to argue. She climbed the ladder to the loft, every muscle protesting. The sleeping pallet was covered with thick furs and wool blankets. It smelled of pine and wood smoke and something else, something wild and clean that she couldn't name. She lay down, still fully dressed, and pulled the blankets over herself. Through the gaps in the loft floor, she could see Silas banking the fire, settling himself on the bench with a blanket of his own. His eyes stared into the flames, distant and thoughtful. In the darkness, Abigail thought back to that terrible moment on the platform. The laughter, the jeers, the humiliation that had burned like fire across her skin. But then she thought of the way Silas had stood tall beside her, the way he had chosen her without a word of shame or hesitation, the way he hadn't mocked her even once. That tiny spark, too fragile to even call hope, was the only warmth she carried with her as exhaustion finally pulled her towards sleep. One thought echoed through her fading consciousness. He didn't laugh at me. Not once. And in the shadows below, Silas sat by the fire, his hand unconsciously moving to touch something beneath his shirt. A small object that hung from a leather cord around his neck. His jaw tightened, his eyes closed briefly, as if bracing against some invisible pain. Then he opened them again and stared into the flames until the fire burned low and darkness claimed the cabin. Morning came too soon. Abigail woke to pale light filtering through the gaps in the log walls. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The gathering, the choosing, the ride up the mountain, this cabin. She was married to a stranger, living in the wilderness miles from anyone she knew. The reality of it pressed down on her chest like a stone. She climbed down from the loft as quietly as she could. Silas was already awake, already dressed, already moving about the cabin with purposeful efficiency. He'd rekindled the fire and set coffee to boil in a battered pot. The smell filled the small space, rich and bitter. He glanced at her briefly. Morning. She managed a small nod. Unable to form words yet, her throat was raw from crying, her eyes swollen. She must look terrible, but Silas didn't seem to notice or care. He poured coffee into 2 cups and handed her one. She wrapped her hands around it, grateful for the warmth. The coffee was strong enough to strip bark from a tree, but it cleared the fog from her mind. There's work to be done. I'll show you where things are. He led her outside into the crisp morning air. The sun was just beginning to touch the highest peaks, painting them gold and pink. The view took her breath away. She'd never seen the mountains from this height, never realized how vast and beautiful they were. Silas pointed to a spring that bubbled up from the rocks about 50 yards from the cabin. That's where you'll get water. The bucket's by the door. Never let the barrel run dry. You'll need it for drinking, cooking, washing. He showed her the chicken coop, opened it to reveal half a dozen hens roosting inside. They'll need grain morning and evening. Scatter it like this, he demonstrated, his movements practiced and efficient. The hens came running, clucking and pecking at the ground. Gather eggs every day. If you leave them, the chickens will start eating them. Abigail watched, trying to absorb everything. She'd done some of these tasks at her father's cabin, but not all of them. Constance had usually handled the chickens, considering it beneath her to let her stepdaughter near anything that might give her a sense of usefulness. Silas showed her the root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin, where vegetables and preserves were stored for winter. The small smokehouse where meat hung curing. The wood pile that needed to be kept stocked. The trap lines he checked every few days. It was overwhelming. So much to remember. So much that could go wrong if she made a mistake. At first, she stumbled through everything, spilled half the grain on the ground, tripped over her own feet carrying the water bucket, nearly dropped the eggs when a hen startled her by pecking at her hand. She expected frustration from him, expected the kind of sharp words and disappointed sighs she'd grown up with, expected him to realize what a mistake he'd made, choosing someone as clumsy and useless as her. Instead, he picked up her dropped bucket and without a word and handed it back. Try again. Slower this time. No anger in his voice, no scorn, just patience. That patience undid her more than any harsh word could have. She'd spent her whole life being told she was worthless, that she couldn't do anything right, that she was nothing but a burden. And here was this man, this stranger, treating her failures as if they were simply learning opportunities rather than fundamental flaws. Day by day, she learned. She swept the cabin floor with a broom made of bundled twigs. She mended a torn leather strap on his snowshoes with trembling fingers, the stitches uneven but holding. She even tried her hand at baking cornbread over the fire, though the first attempt came out hard as creek stones. Silas took a piece anyway, bit into it with a slight grimace, then the faintest hint of a smile tugged at his weathered lips. Not bad. Her chest ached at those 2 simple words. For the first time in her life, someone was allowing her to fail without shame, without mockery, without making her feel worthless. Evenings brought a different kind of quiet. After the work was done and they'd eaten their simple meal, Silas would sit by the fire while Abigail cleaned up. Sometimes he'd work on equipment, sharpening knives, oiling rifle parts, mending leather. Sometimes he'd just stare into the flames, his expression distant and unreadable. One evening, about a week after she'd arrived, Abigail caught a glimpse of something silver in his hands. She tried not to stare, but curiosity got the better of her. It was a small pendant on a leather cord, oval-shaped, the kind that might hold a miniature portrait inside. Silas noticed her looking. His jaw tightened. He closed the pendant quickly and tucked it back inside his shirt, against his chest where it hung hidden. She wanted to ask about it, wanted to know whose image was inside, but the look on his face stopped her. It was grief, raw and deep, carefully hidden but there nonetheless. He carried pain, just like she did. He knew what it was to be alone, to lose someone. Her heart softened. She turned back to washing the dishes, giving him privacy for whatever memories haunted him. The silence between them began to feel less awkward as the days passed. It wasn't filled with tension or discomfort anymore. It was simply the quiet of 2 people learning to exist in the same space, learning each other's rhythms and habits. Abigail learned that Silas rose before dawn every day, that he always checked his rifle before leaving the cabin, that he took his coffee, black and strong enough to wake the dead. She learned that he was meticulous about maintaining his equipment, that he never wasted anything, that he moved through the wilderness with the confidence of someone who'd been born to it. She learned, too, that he was kind in small ways. He left extra blankets on her pallet when the nights grew colder. He brought back fresh meat from his hunts and showed her how to prepare it properly. He never commented on her mistakes, only showed her the correct way to do things and let her try again. 2 weeks after the gathering, Silas asked if she wanted to ride with him to check his trap lines. The question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on learning the tasks around the cabin that she hadn't thought about venturing further into the wilderness. "I've never really ridden a horse." "Not properly." He studied her for a moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. "Then today you learn." Fear twisted her stomach into knots. The memory of falling at the gathering, of the laughter that had followed, was still fresh and painful. But something in his tone, calm and certain, made her step forward instead of backing away. He brought the gray horse out of the stable and saddled it with practiced efficiency. Then he turned to her and waited. Abigail approached the massive animal hesitantly. It seemed impossibly tall, impossibly intimidating. The horse turned its head to look at her with one large brown eye, and she froze. "Her name's Storm. She won't hurt you." Silas lifted Abigail into the saddle as though she weighed nothing at all. The horse shifted beneath her, and she clutched the leather reins with white-knuckled terror. "Easy." His hand was steady at her back, warm and reassuring through the fabric of her dress. "I've got you." Those words again, the same words he'd spoken at the gathering. And just like then, they held more comfort than any lengthy reassurance could have offered. He swung up behind her, his arms reaching around to take the reins. She was acutely aware of his presence, the solid strength of his chest against her back, the warmth of his body cutting through the cold mountain air. The horse moved forward at a walk, following a narrow trail that wound up through the pines. Abigail's muscles were rigid with fear at first, but gradually she began to relax. Silas's presence behind her was steady, anchoring, and the horse moved with surprising gentleness despite its size. They rode for an hour, climbing higher into the mountains than Abigail had ever been. The trail opened up at one point, revealing a vista that stole her breath. The valley spread out below them, the settlement visible as tiny clusters of cabins near the creek. Beyond that, range after range of mountains stretched to the horizon, their peaks white with early snow. "It's beautiful." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Silas made a sound that might have been agreement. They continued on to his trap lines, a series of carefully placed snares and deadfalls set up to catch beaver and fox. He showed her how to check each one, how to reset them, how to read the signs of animal activity. His voice was patient as he explained, and Abigail found herself actually understanding, actually able to help in small ways. On the ride back, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The horse broke into a gentle trot, and Abigail felt a laugh bubble up in her chest before she could stop it. The sound startled even her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed, really laughed, with warmth rather than bitterness. But here, on this horse, with the mountains spread out around her and the cold wind in her face, she didn't feel clumsy. She didn't feel worthless. She felt alive. She felt capable. She felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a place in this world for her after all. Behind her, Silas's arms tightened slightly around her waist, not constraining, just steadying. And though he didn't speak, Abigail thought she felt him relax slightly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. That night, after they'd eaten and she'd cleaned up, Abigail worked up the courage to speak. She'd been thinking about it all evening, trying to find the right words. "Thank you for teaching me, for being patient with me." Silas looked up from the knife he was sharpening. His expression was unreadable in the firelight. "You're learning. That's all that matters. But most people wouldn't have bothered. Most people would have given up on me by now." His jaw tightened. "I'm not most people." The words hung between them, simple but weighted with meaning. Abigail nodded, not trusting herself to speak without crying again. One evening, maybe 3 weeks after she'd arrived, Silas came back from checking the trap lines earlier than usual. His expression was troubled, his movements tense. Abigail was preparing dinner, venison stew that actually smelled decent this time, and she glanced up as he entered. Something wrong? He set his rifle down more forcefully than usual. Saw tracks, human, not animal. Someone's been up near the high pass. Fear prickled along Abigail's spine. Who would be up there? Don't know. Could be trappers passing through. Could be something else. He didn't elaborate, but the concern in his voice was clear. The high country was dangerous, especially this late in the season. Anyone venturing that far up had a specific purpose, and not all purposes were good. That night, Silas checked the cabin door twice before settling by the fire. He kept his rifle within arm's reach. Abigail watched from the loft, her own worry growing. She'd felt safe here, isolated but protected. Now she realized how vulnerable they were, how far from help if trouble came. She didn't sleep well. Every sound outside made her tense, the wind in the pines, an owl's cry, the distant howl of wolves. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were troubled, filled with shadows and unnamed threats. Morning brought no answers, only more questions. Silas seemed preoccupied, his attention divided between the daily tasks and whatever danger he sensed approaching. Abigail tried to help as best she could, tried to be useful rather than another thing for him to worry about. But she couldn't shake the feeling that their fragile peace was about to shatter. 2 days passed before the mystery revealed itself. Abigail was gathering eggs from the coop when she heard voices carrying up from the lower trail. Her heart jumped into her throat. Visitors were rare this far up the mountain, and after Silas's warning about the tracks, any stranger felt like a threat. She hurried back to the cabin. Silas was already at the door, rifle in hand, his posture alert but not aggressive. 3 men emerged from the tree line, leading pack horses laden with furs and supplies. Trappers by the look of them, though cleaner and better equipped than most who passed through these mountains. The man in front raised his hand in greeting. His smile was wan, friendly, but something about it made Abigail's skin crawl. Silas Thorne, heard you were still up here. Marcus Webb. Silas's voice was flat, giving nothing away. The 2 men clearly knew each other, but there was no warmth in the recognition. Webb's eyes shifted to Abigail, and his smile widened. And this must be the bride. The whole settlement's been talking about your choice at Crawford's gathering. Quite the surprise that was. Heat flooded Abigail's face. She stepped closer to the cabin, wishing she could disappear inside, but Silas's slight gesture kept her where she was. His message was clear. Don't show weakness. Don't hide. We're passing through. Just wanted to pay respects. See how you're managing up here now that you've got company. Webb's tone was light, conversational, but his eyes were calculating. Winter's coming early this year. Might be a hard one. We'll manage. Course you will. You always do. Webb glanced at his companions, 2 younger men who stood silent and watchful. But if you need anything, you know where to find us. We're setting up camp down near Black Rock Creek for the season. The offer hung in the air, seemingly generous but laced with something Abigail couldn't quite name. Silas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Appreciate it, but we're well supplied. Webb's smile never wavered. Good to hear. Well, we won't keep you. Just wanted to be neighborly. He tipped his hat in Abigail's direction. Ma'am, the 3 men mounted their horses and disappeared back down the trail. Silas stood watching until they were completely out of sight, then turned and went back into the cabin. His movements were controlled, deliberate, but Abigail could sense the tension radiating from him like heat from the forge. Who was that? Silas set his rifle down, checked it was loaded, then began checking the other weapons stored around the cabin. Trouble. That's not an answer. He paused, his gray eyes meeting hers. Marcus Webb is a man who takes what he wants and calls it opportunity. Used to trap these mountains with his brother until his brother died in an avalanche 3 winters back. Some folks said it wasn't an accident. Abigail's blood ran cold. And he's camped nearby. Close enough. Silas pulled down a shotgun from above the door, checked its load. We'll keep our guard up. Don't go anywhere alone. If you see anyone approaching, you get inside and bar the door. The next week passed in heightened awareness. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made Abigail jump. Silas kept his rifle closer than usual, and she noticed he was checking the trap lines more frequently, though she suspected he was actually scouting for signs of Webb's camp. But no one came. The mountain was quiet except for the wind and the animals. Slowly, gradually, the tension began to ease. Abigail threw herself into learning everything Silas could teach her. It was partly to be useful, to prove she wasn't just a burden, but also to distract herself from worrying about threats, both known and unknown. She learned to recognize different animal tracks in the snow that had started to fall, learned which plants were edible and which would kill you, learned how to properly cure meat and preserve vegetables for the long winter ahead. She was kneading bread dough one afternoon, her hands working the mixture with growing confidence, when Silas spoke from his place by the fire. "You're getting better at this." The simple observation made warmth bloom in her chest. "Thank you." He was working on a piece of leather, cutting it into strips for snowshoe bindings. His hands moved with practiced precision, each cut clean and exact. "Your mother teach you to cook?" Abigail's hands stilled in the dough. "My real mother died when I was 12. Fever took her one winter. My stepmother never bothered teaching me much of anything. Said I'd just waste the effort since no man would ever want me anyway." The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. She'd never spoken about Constance to anyone, never admitted how deeply those years of casual cruelty had cut. Silas's knife paused mid-cut. She was wrong. Abigail looked up, surprised. He wasn't looking at her, his attention seemingly focused on the leather, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "My mother used to say that the measure of a person isn't in how they look or how graceful they move. It's in how they face hardship, how they treat others when there's nothing to gain from kindness." He'd never mentioned his mother before. Abigail held her breath, afraid that if she spoke, he'd stop. "You helped that little girl at the gathering, the one who'd fallen." "I saw you." Abigail's hands resumed kneading, slower now. "Everyone saw me. That's why they laughed. I saw kindness, saw someone who put another person's pain before her own fear of mockery. Sorrow. That's rare. Rarer than beauty or grace or any of the things people prize at gatherings." The words settled over her like a warm blanket. She didn't know what to say, how to respond to this unexpected glimpse into how he saw her. So she focused on the dough, shaping it into loaves, and let the silence stretch between them. Comfortable now, almost companionable. That evening after dinner, Silas did something unexpected. He reached into a wooden chest near his sleeping bench and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. He hesitated, his rough fingers tracing the cover, then crossed to where Abigail sat near the fire. This was hers, my wife's. Sarah. He said the name carefully, as if testing its weight after years of silence. Abigail took the book with gentle hands. It was a journal, the pages filled with neat handwriting. Some entries were accompanied by small sketches, flowers, birds, the mountain peaks. She loved to draw, loved to write about the small things she noticed each day. The way light fell through the pines, the sound of the creek in spring, things I never paid enough attention to until she was gone. Abigail looked up at him. "How long ago?" 2 years, almost 3 now. What happened?" His jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck stood out like cords. She was young, 23. "We'd been married less than a year. There was a gathering, much like the one where I chose you. Her father was trying to arrange marriages for her younger sisters. Sarah went to help, to support them." He paused, his eyes distant, seeing something Abigail couldn't. She was always soft-hearted, always putting others first. There were some women there who'd been cruel to her when we married, jealous that she'd been chosen by a man who could provide well. They started in on her at the gathering. Said terrible things. She tried to ignore it, tried to be strong, but it wore on her. Abigail's heart clenched. She knew that kind of cruelty intimately. We rode home that night and she seemed quiet, but I thought she was just tired. I woke the next morning and she was gone. Found her down by the creek. She'd walked into the water during the night. The cold took her before I even knew she was missing. The words hung in the air like ice crystals, beautiful and devastating. Abigail felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I'm so sorry." Silas took the journal back, held it against his chest. I blamed myself. Should have seen how much pain she was in. Should have protected her better. I came up here to the high country and told myself I'd never go back down. Never participate in their customs again. Never give them the chance to hurt someone I cared about. Then why did you? Why did you choose me? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. Because I saw her in you. Saw someone being torn down by people who should have known better. Saw that same soft heart trying to survive in a hard world. And I couldn't watch it happen again. Couldn't stand by and let them destroy you the way they destroyed her. Abigail's breath caught. You chose me to save me. I chose you because you deserve better than what they were giving you. And because maybe, in saving you, I could make some kind of peace with failing to save her. The honesty in his words was almost painful. This wasn't a romantic declaration. It was something deeper, more complicated. Grief and guilt and determination all tangled together. He'd chosen her not out of love, but out of a desperate need to rewrite a tragedy he'd been unable to prevent. Part of her wanted to be angry about that, wanted to feel used, manipulated, chosen for the wrong reasons. But looking at the pain in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he held his dead wife's journal, she couldn't find anger, only understanding. I'm not her. The words came out gentle but firm. Silas nodded. I know. You're stronger than she was. Stronger than you know. That night, lying in the loft, Abigail thought about Sarah. About a young woman who'd been crushed by cruelty, who'd seen no way out except the cold embrace of the creek. She thought about how easily that could have been her own story, if circumstances had been different, if the mockery had gone on long enough to break something inside her that couldn't be repaired. But Silas had stopped that story from being written. He'd chosen her, and in choosing her, he'd given her a chance at a different ending. She fell asleep with tears on her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of something she was only beginning to understand. Gratitude mixed with a fierce determination not to waste the second chance she'd been given. The first real snow came a week later. Abigail woke to find the world transformed, everything white and pristine and impossibly quiet. Silas was already outside, clearing a path from the cabin to the stable. She watched him through the window, his breath steaming in the frigid air, his movements efficient despite the cold. She dressed quickly and went to help. The snow came up past her ankles, soaking through her worn boots within minutes. The cold bit at her fingers even through her mittens, but she grabbed a shovel and began clearing the path to the chicken coop. They worked side by side in silence, the only sounds the scrape of shovels and the soft whisper of falling snow. When the paths were clear, Silas showed her how to check the cabin for drafts, how to bank the fire properly for maximum heat with minimum wood consumption. Winter had arrived, and survival now depended on preparation and careful resource management. That afternoon, Silas announced they needed to go down to the settlement for supplies before the heavy snows made the trail impassable. Abigail's stomach dropped. Do I have to go? Yes. The word was firm. She wanted to argue, wanted to beg him to let her stay here where it was safe, where no one could mock her. But she could see in his expression that this wasn't negotiable. They set out the next morning, the world still white and beautiful around them. Storm carried them both down the mountain trail, picking her way carefully through the snow. Abigail's heart grew heavier with each step that brought them closer to the settlement. The settlement square was bustling when they arrived, despite the cold. Traders calling out prices, trappers haggling over pelts, women gossiping near the provision store. And when Silas and Abigail rode in together, heads turned just like before, but this time the whispers were different. Speculation rather than mockery, surprise rather than laughter. They're still together, thought for sure he'd have sent her back by now. Must be some kind of arrangement. He needs help with winter chores, maybe. Silas dismounted first, then helped Abigail down. His hand lingered on her waist for just a moment, steadying her, and that small gesture didn't go unnoticed by the watching crowd. They walked together toward the provision store, and Abigail felt every eye on them. Her steps faltered. Old, familiar shame rushed back like floodwater, threatening to drown her. All the peace she'd found in the mountains seemed to evaporate in the cruel air of the settlement. Beside her, Silas didn't slow. His jaw remained steady. His pace didn't change. Then his hand brushed against hers, barely a touch, just his rough fingers grazing her knuckles. But it felt like an anchor in a storm. They reached the provision store and Silas began selecting supplies: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, lamp oil. The storekeeper, a wiry man named Dalton, who'd been running this place for 15 years, rang up each item with careful attention to his ledger. That's a fair amount of supplies, Thorne. Planning to make it through winter without coming back down? That's the idea. Dalton's eyes flicked to Abigail. She helping you haul all this? She does more than haul. The words were simple, but there was steel underneath them. Dalton nodded and went back to tallying the supplies, wisely choosing not to comment further. Outside the store, they nearly ran into a cluster of women Abigail recognized from the gathering. Margaret and Catherine, her stepsisters, along with two of the Crawford daughters. They stopped short, surprise flickering across their faces. Abigail, Catherine's voice held something that might have been genuine surprise. You're still here. Where else would I be? The response came out before Abigail could think better of it. Catherine blinked, taken aback. Margaret recovered first, her expression settling into something carefully neutral. We heard you'd gone up to Thorne's cabin. Thought maybe you'd come back down by now. This is my home now. The words felt strange in her mouth, but also right somehow. These women who'd shared her father's cabin, who'd watched her be mocked and never said a word in her defense, they had no claim on her anymore. One of the Crawford daughters, Eleanor, if Abigail remembered correctly, spoke up. How are you managing? Up there in the high country? It must be terribly isolated. I'm learning. Getting stronger. Eleanor's eyes were kind, curious. Good, that's good. The conversation died into awkward silence. Then Louisa appeared from inside the store, her arms full of packages. She stopped when she saw Abigail, and her face broke into a genuine smile, the first truly warm expression Abigail had seen from anyone in the settlement. Abigail, you look well. Different somehow. I feel different. It was true. Standing here now, Abigail realized she didn't feel the crushing shame she'd expected. The old wounds were still there, still tender, but they didn't control her the way they once had. She'd survived a month in the wilderness. She'd learned to ride, to trap, to prepare for winter. She'd earned her place, even if these women didn't understand that. Silas appeared beside her, arms loaded with supply sacks. Ready? She nodded. The women parted to let them through. As they walked away, Abigail heard Louisa whisper to the others, She does look different, stronger somehow. They loaded the supplies onto Storm and began the journey back up the mountain. The sun was past its peak, painting long shadows across the snow. Abigail rode behind Silas, her arms around his waist, and for the first time since arriving at this settlement years ago, she felt like she could breathe properly. You did well back there. Silas's voice was quiet, almost lost in the sound of Storm's hooves crunching through snow. I didn't do anything. You stood your ground. Didn't apologize for existing. That's everything. The trail grew steeper. They passed into the tree line, leaving the settlement behind. The shadows of the pines fell across them, cool and peaceful. An elk crashed through the underbrush nearby, startled by their passage. Silas, why did you really come down to that gathering? If you'd been avoiding the settlement for 2 years, why show up at all? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I needed supplies. Thought I could trade my pelts and leave before Crawford started his ceremony. But he had men watching, making sure every able man participated. Said it was custom, that we owed it to the settlement's future. And you don't believe in the custom? I believe in giving people choices, not forcing them into situations because it's always been done that way. His voice hardened. Sarah didn't have a choice about going to that gathering where they destroyed her. Her father insisted, said it was family duty, and I couldn't protect her from the consequences. But you protected me. I tried. They rode in silence for a while. Then Abigail spoke again, her voice small. What if I can't be what you need? What if I'm still just a burden? You're not a burden. You're learning faster than anyone I've taught before. You don't complain about the work or the isolation. You're exactly what this life needs. The words settled warm in her chest. She tightened her arms around him slightly, allowing herself this small comfort. The cabin appeared through the trees as twilight gathered. Smoke rose from the chimney. Silas had banked the fire carefully before they left, and it had kept burning in their absence. The sight of it, this solid structure that was now her home, filled Abigail with unexpected emotion. This was hers, not her father's house where she'd never been wanted, not some place she was tolerated out of obligation. This was a place she'd earned through hard work and determination. They unloaded the supplies together, working efficiently in the fading light. Silas showed her how to store everything properly, how to seal the flour and coffee against moisture, how to organize the ammunition so it stayed dry and accessible. That night, after dinner, Abigail worked up her courage. "There's something I need to tell you." Silas looked up from the leather he was working on. "My father, Warren Hewitt, he wasn't always cruel to me. When my mother was alive, he was different, kinder. But after she died and he married Constance, it was like he couldn't stand the sight of me, like I reminded him too much of what he'd lost." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand. I'm not just some pathetic creature who needs rescuing. I had a life before it all fell apart. I had a mother who loved me, who taught me things, who made me believe I had value. And then I lost all that, and I forgot how to believe it myself." She pulled out something she'd been keeping hidden in her pocket, a small wooden bird, crudely carved but recognizable. "My mother made this for me when I was 8. It's the only thing of hers I managed to keep when Constance moved into the house. She was good with her hands, good at making things beautiful." Silas took the bird carefully, studying it in the firelight. "It's well made. She used to tell me I was strong." That strength came in different forms, not just in muscles or the ability to shoot straight, but in the ability to keep going when everything hurt, to be kind when the world was cruel. "I'd forgotten that until I came here. You're remembering now." She nodded. "Because you're giving me the chance to. Because you see something in me worth saving." He handed the bird back. "You were always worth saving, Abigail. You just needed someone to remind you." That night, lying in the loft, Abigail thought about her mother, about the woman who died too young, leaving her daughter to face the world's cruelty alone. But she also thought about Sarah, about another woman who'd been lost to that same cruelty. Two women connected by tragedy, by the casual destruction of soft hearts in a hard world. And she made a silent vow. She wouldn't let their deaths be meaningless. She would survive. She would grow stronger. She would prove that kindness wasn't weakness, that softness wasn't failure, that there was room in these harsh mountains for people who cared deeply and loved fiercely. She would live the life they couldn't. The next morning brought fresh challenges. The snow had fallen heavily during the night, drifting against the cabin door and burying the paths they'd cleared. Silas woke her before dawn. "Storm's coming. Big one. We need to make sure everything's secured." They worked frantically through the early morning, bringing in extra firewood, checking that the stable was weatherproof, making sure the chickens had enough food and water to last several days, securing the shutters over the windows. Every task was critical because once the storm hit, they'd be trapped inside until it passed. By midday, the wind had picked up, howling through the pines like a living thing. Snow fell so thick Abigail could barely see 10 feet in front of her. They finished the last preparations and retreated inside just as the storm's full fury descended. The cabin shook under the assault of wind. Snow piled against the walls, drifting up past the windows. The temperature inside dropped despite the roaring fire. Silas hung extra blankets over the door and windows, creating barriers against the cold. Abigail heated stones in the fire, then wrapped them in cloth to place at the foot of the sleeping pallet for warmth. They were trapped together in this small space, cut off from the outside world completely. For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. They slept in shifts, one of them always awake to tend the fire. They rationed food carefully, not knowing how long they'd be stuck. They barely spoke, conserving energy, existing in a strange twilight state between waking and sleeping. On the 4th day, the wind finally died. The silence that followed was almost shocking after days of relentless noise. Silas opened the door to find snow drifted nearly to the roof. They were completely buried. It took hours to dig their way out. They worked together, passing shovels, spelling each other when arms grew tired. Finally, they broke through into brilliant sunshine. The world was transformed, every tree weighted with snow, every surface gleaming white, the air so cold it burned to breathe. The stable had held. The chickens had survived. The cabin had weathered the storm without damage. They'd made it through their first real test of winter. That evening, exhausted but victorious, they sat by the fire sharing a meal of hot stew. Abigail felt something shift between them. They'd survived this together, relied on each other, worked as partners rather than master and burden. She'd proven she could handle hardship without breaking. Silas must have felt it too because, for the first time since she'd arrived, he smiled at her. Not the faint ghost of a smile she'd seen before, but a real one that reached his eyes and softened his weathered face. You did good. Real good. The praise warmed her more than the fire ever could. Winter deepened its grip on the mountains. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Snow fell almost daily, sometimes gentle flurries that dusted the pines. Other times blizzards that trapped them inside for days. Abigail learned to read the sky, to recognize the signs of coming weather. She learned which tasks could be postponed and which had to be done regardless of conditions. She also learned to shoot. Silas started her with a small rifle, teaching her to hold it properly, to sight down the barrel, to squeeze the trigger rather than pull. Her first attempts were disasters. The recoil knocked her backward. Her shots went wide. She flinched before firing and threw off her aim. But Silas was patient. He showed her how to brace herself, how to breathe, how to become part of the weapon rather than fighting against it. After 2 weeks of practice, she hit her first target, a mark carved into a tree trunk 50 yards from the cabin. The surge of pride she felt was almost overwhelming. She'd done something her father had always said she was too clumsy to manage. She'd proven him wrong. Good. Now do it again. She did, and again, until hitting the target became more common than missing. One evening, about 2 months after she'd arrived at the cabin, Abigail was preparing dinner when she realized something had changed. She moved around the small space with confidence now, no longer second-guessing every action. She knew where everything belonged, knew how Silas liked his coffee, knew the rhythm of their days together. More than that, she'd stopped waiting for him to tell her she was failing, stopped bracing for criticism that never came, stopped seeing herself through her father's eyes. She looked down at her hands, rough and calloused now from work. Strong hands, capable hands. Hands that could chop wood and mend leather and bring down a deer at 100 yards. When had that happened? When had she become this person? Silas noticed her studying her hands. Something on your mind? I was just thinking about how different I am now, how different I feel. Different how? She struggled to find words. Like I'm solid, like I take up space in the world, and that's okay. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. He stood and crossed to the shelf where he kept Sarah's journal. He'd shown it to Abigail that once, weeks ago, and then put it away. Now he opened it, flipped through pages, found what he was looking for. Sarah wrote this about a month before she died. He read aloud, "The worst prison isn't made of bars. It's made of other people's opinions. They tell you who you are, what you're worth, and if you believe them long enough, you forget how to believe anything else." He closed the journal. You're breaking out of that prison. That's what's different. Abigail felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, healing tears. Did she ever break out? She was starting to, but she didn't have enough time. His voice cracked slightly on those last words. He turned away, busying himself with banking the fire, but Abigail had seen the grief flash across his face, raw and still painful despite the years. She wanted to comfort him, but didn't know how. So she did the only thing she could think of. She finished making dinner and set his portion on the table, exactly the way he liked it. Small kindnesses. That was all she had to offer, but maybe it was enough. They ate in comfortable silence. Outside, wind rattled the shutters and snow whispered against the walls. The fire crackled. The lamp cast warm light across the rough-hewn table. This cabin, once so foreign and frightening, had become a sanctuary. After dinner, Silas pulled out a whetstone and began sharpening knives. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was soothing. Abigail settled near the fire with a shirt of his that needed mending. Her stitches were getting neater, more even. Another skill learned. Can I ask you something? He looked up from his work. Why did you really stay away from the settlement for so long? Was it just grief, or was there more? His jaw tightened. He set down the knife he'd been working on, considering his answer carefully. After Sarah died, I blamed the settlement, blamed their customs, their cruelty, their need to tear people down. But I also blamed myself for bringing her into that world, for thinking love would be enough to protect her from it. He paused, his gray eyes distant. I came up here to escape. Thought if I cut myself off completely, I'd never have to feel that kind of pain again. No attachments meant no loss. But you came back down. For the gathering. I told myself it was just for supplies, that I'd trade my pelts and leave before the ceremony started. But deep down, I think part of me knew what Crawford would do, knew he'd force every man to participate, and maybe some broken part of me wanted to be forced, wanted to have the choice taken away so I wouldn't have to admit I was ready to try again. Try what again? Living. Really living, not just surviving. The honesty in his words took her breath away. This was the most he'd ever revealed about himself, about the scars he carried that matched her own. When I saw you on that platform, he continued, saw the way they were tearing you apart with their laughter. I pushed Sarah, saw another soft heart being destroyed by hard people, and I couldn't let it happen again. Even if all I could give you was safety, isolation, a chance to heal away from their poison, I had to try. You gave me more than that. You gave me myself back. His eyes met hers across the small space. You did that on your own. I just gave you room to do it. They held that gaze for a long moment. Something unspoken passed between them, fragile and new. Then Silas returned to his knife sharpening and Abigail to her mending. But the air felt different somehow, charged with possibility. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Abigail was feeding the chickens when she heard horses approaching. Her heart leapt into her throat. She ran back to the cabin, calling for Silas. He emerged with his rifle, his expression grim. Get inside. Bar the door. But now she obeyed, her hands shaking as she dropped the heavy bar across the door. Through a gap in the shutters, she watched 3 riders emerge from the tree line. Her stomach dropped when she recognized them. Marcus Webb and his 2 companions. They stopped about 30 yards from the cabin, close enough to talk but far enough to avoid seeming immediately threatening. Webb raised his hand in greeting, that same wide smile on his face. Morning, Thorne. Thought we'd check on you, see how you weathered that last storm. We're fine. Silas stood on the porch, rifle held casually but ready. His entire posture radiated controlled threat. Good to hear. Webb's eyes scanned the cabin, the cleared paths, the smoke rising from the chimney. You and your bride managing well up here? Well enough. That's real good. Because I'd hate to think of a woman suffering up here in the cold. Isolated. No one to help if something went wrong. The words were friendly, but the underlying threat was clear. Abigail pressed closer to the gap in the shutters, her breath fogging the cold glass. My wife is fine. We're well supplied and prepared for winter. I'm sure you are. But winter's long, Thorne. Lot can happen. Accidents, equipment failures. A man alone up here with just a woman for company. It's dangerous. Silas's grip on his rifle tightened slightly. I appreciate your concern, but we don't need anything from you. Now, don't be hasty. Webb leaned forward in his saddle. I'm offering neighborly assistance. If you need help, we're right down at Black Rock Creek, close enough to reach in an emergency. And if I don't want neighbors that close? Webb's smile never faltered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Then I'd say you're being foolish. Mountains don't care about pride, Thorne. They kill the proud just as quick as the weak. I've survived these mountains longer than you've been trapping them, Webb. That you have. But you were alone then. Now you've got responsibilities. A wife to protect. Makes a man vulnerable. The threat was barely veiled now. Abigail's heart pounded against her ribs. She wanted to scream at them to leave, wanted to grab a rifle herself and drive them away, but she forced herself to stay quiet, to trust that Silas knew how to handle this. I protect what's mine. Silas's voice dropped lower, harder. And I don't take kindly to threats, veiled or otherwise. No threat intended, just friendly advice. Webb straightened in his saddle. but I'll leave you to your peace for now." The last two words hung in the air like a promise of future trouble. Webb and his men turned their horses and rode back into the trees. They moved slowly, deliberately, making it clear they weren't afraid or retreating, just choosing to leave. Silas stood on the porch until they were completely out of sight. Then he came inside, barred the door behind him, and immediately began checking weapons. What did he want? Abigail's voice came out shakier than she'd intended. Silas paused in his work, looking at her with those steady gray eyes. To let us know he's watching. To remind us we're vulnerable up here. To see if I'd scare easily. Will you? No, but we need to be smarter, more careful. He pulled down the shotgun from above the door, checked its load. From now on, you keep a weapon within reach at all times. You know how to use the rifle now. If anyone comes and I'm not here, you don't open the door. You don't negotiate. You just aim through the shutters and make it clear you'll shoot if they try to force their way in. Abigail nodded, her mouth dry. This was a different kind of danger than she'd faced before. Mockery and shame were terrible, but they couldn't kill you. Webb and his men were a physical threat, and the isolation that had felt like sanctuary now felt like vulnerability. Why is he doing this? What does he want? Silas's jaw tightened. Webb's the kind of man who sees everything as a transaction. He probably figures a woman up here, isolated and dependent. She's a resource. If he can drive me away or eliminate me, he gets access to the cabin, the trap lines, maybe even you. Horror flooded through Abigail. He can't. He won't. Silas's voice was absolute. I won't let him near you, but we need to be prepared for him to try. That night, neither of them slept well. Silas kept his rifle within arm's reach, and every sound outside made them tense. The wind in the pines, a branch breaking under the weight of snow, an owl's distant cry. Each noise could be innocent or could be Webb and his men circling closer. Morning brought no relief, only heightened awareness. Silas spent the day checking and rechecking their defenses, making sure the cabin was secure, that they had clear sight lines in all directions, that their weapons were loaded and ready. Abigail tried to maintain their normal routine, feeding chickens, hauling water, preparing meals, but fear sat in her stomach like a stone. She'd finally found safety, finally started to heal, and now this threat loomed over everything. 3 days passed with no sign of Webb. The waiting was almost worse than a direct confrontation. Every moment stretched taut with tension. Silas barely left the cabin, only venturing out to tend the animals and bring in firewood. The trap lines went unchecked. They couldn't risk being too far from the cabin, too vulnerable. On the 4th day, Silas made a decision. We need to go back down to the settlement. Abigail's heart sank. Why? Because if Webb's planning something, I want witnesses to know we're alive and well now. I want it known that if anything happens to us, he was here making threats. It's protection of a sort, but the settlement... I know. Silas's expression softened slightly. I know it's hard for you there, but this is necessary. They set out the next morning, both armed, both watchful. The trail down seemed longer than Abigail remembered, each bend potentially hiding an ambush. But they reached the settlement without incident. The square was less busy this time, the deep cold keeping most people close to their fires. But word of their arrival spread quickly. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, curious and whispering. Tobias Crawford emerged from his cabin, his weathered face creased with concern. Silas, heard you've had visitors up your way. So he already knew. Information traveled fast in the mountains, even in winter. Marcus Webb stopped by, making threats thinly disguised as neighborly concern. Crawford's expression darkened. Webb's trouble, always has been. His brother learned that the hard way. You think he killed his brother? Can't prove it. But Jonas Webb was an experienced mountaineer. Don't make sense he'd trigger an avalanche in terrain he knew like his own hand. Crawford spat into the snow. You watch yourself, Thorne. Webb's patient. He'll wait for the right moment. That's why I'm here. Wanted folks to know we're well, in case Webb tries something and then claims it was an accident. Smart. Crawford glanced at Abigail, who stood slightly behind Silas, her hand resting on the rifle slung across her back. Your woman looks like she can handle herself now. She can. Pride colored Silas's voice. and Abigail felt warmth bloom in her chest despite the cold and the fear. They spent an hour at the provision store, restocking supplies and making their presence known. Abigail noticed people watching her differently now, not with the outright mockery of before, but with a kind of wary respect. She was no longer the pathetic girl who'd stumbled on the platform. She was the woman who'd survived months in the high country, who carried a rifle with confidence, who stood beside Silas Thorne as an equal rather than a burden. Warren Hewitt appeared as they were loading their supplies onto Storm. Abigail's stomach clenched when she saw her father approaching. She hadn't spoken to him since the gathering, hadn't even thought about him much, but seeing him now brought back a flood of old pain. Abigail. His voice was gruff, uncertain. He looked older than she remembered, his face more deeply lined, his shoulders stooped. Father. The word came out formal, distant. They were strangers now, connected only by blood and shared history. You look well. Different. I am different. Warren's eyes flicked to Silas, who stood a few feet away, giving them space but watchful. He treating you right? The question surprised her. There was genuine concern in it, something she hadn't expected. He treats me better than I've ever been treated. He sees my worth. Warren flinched at that, the implied criticism landing hard. Your stepmother says I should. That is, she thinks maybe I was too hard on you. Before, maybe. The word came out sharper than she'd intended. Warren shifted his weight, uncomfortable. I was wrong, about you, about what you were capable of. He gestured toward her, taking in the rifle, the confident posture, the way she held herself. You're stronger than I gave you credit for. Abigail wanted to feel vindicated, wanted this admission to heal something inside her. But all she felt was tired. Tired of caring what he thought, tired of needing his approval, tired of the weight of his disappointment that she'd carried for so long. Thank you for saying that, but it doesn't change anything. You made your choices, I've made mine. Warren nodded slowly. Fair enough. He started to turn away, then paused. If you need anything, if things go wrong up there, you've got family here still. I've got all the family I need. She glanced at Silas as she said it, and something passed between them. Not love exactly, not yet, but partnership, trust. The foundation of something that could become love, if given time to grow. Warren left without another word. Abigail watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. She'd wanted his approval for so long, and now that she had something like it, she found it didn't matter anymore. She'd built her worth on her own achievements, not his opinion. They rode back up the mountain in silence. The sun was setting, painting the snow pink and gold. Despite the threat from Webb, despite the confrontation with her father, Abigail felt something like peace settling over her. She'd faced her past. She'd proven herself. She'd claimed her place in this harsh world. Whatever came next, she would meet it head on. Back at the cabin, they settled into their evening routine, but something had shifted between them during the day. Abigail caught Silas watching her while she prepared dinner, his expression thoughtful. When their hands brushed while passing plates, neither pulled away quickly. That night, after the meal was cleared and they sat by the fire, Silas spoke quietly. I'm proud of you, the way you handled yourself today. Your father, the settlement, all of it. I had good training. He smiled, that rare full smile that transformed his face. You had courage. That's not something I can teach. Abigail met his eyes across the firelight. You gave me the space to find it again. That's more valuable than any lesson. They held that gaze for a long moment. Then Silas stood and crossed to where she sat. He held out his hand, that same gesture from the gathering, from their first ride together. But this time it felt different. This time it felt like a choice rather than a rescue. Dance with me. The words were so unexpected that Abigail almost laughed. Here? Now here. Now there's no music. We don't need music. He pulled her gently to her feet. His rough hand found her waist. His other hand clasped hers. They stood like that for a moment, not moving, just existing in this small space where firelight met shadow. Then Silas began to move, slow and steady like the creek in summer. No fancy steps, no practiced grace, just simple movement, one foot then another, turning slowly in the small cabin. Abigail followed his lead, and for the first time in her life, Dancing didn't feel like mockery or humiliation. It felt like joy, like freedom, like claiming something that had been stolen from her and making it hers again. They moved together until the fire burned low and the cold began to creep in. Then Silas stepped back, his hands lingering on her waist for just a moment before releasing her. Sleep well, Abigail. You too. She climbed to the loft, her heart full in ways she couldn't quite name. Below, she heard Silas settling on his bench, heard the rustle of blankets as he prepared for sleep. And in the darkness, she smiled, because tonight she'd danced, and it had been beautiful. The next week passed quietly. No sign of Webb, no threats, just the steady rhythm of winter life. Chopping wood, hauling water, tending animals, preparing meals. The work was hard but satisfying. Abigail could see the results of her labor in the stocked woodpile, the fed chickens, the warm cabin. She also noticed she was changing physically. The constant work had built muscle in her arms and shoulders. Her hands were calloused but strong. She could split wood now without stopping every few minutes to rest, could haul full water buckets without her arms shaking. Her body was still large, still the shape that had brought so much mockery. But it was capable now, powerful. She was learning to see it as a tool rather than a liability, to appreciate what it could do rather than hate what it looked like. One afternoon, Silas asked her to come check the trap lines with him. They'd been leaving them alone too long, worried about ambush, but they needed the pelts for income and couldn't afford to let them sit empty all winter. They rode out together, both armed, both alert. The trap lines ran along a ridge line about 2 miles from the cabin, through dense forest that provided good cover for game animals. Silas had set snares and deadfalls in a pattern that took advantage of natural animal highways. The first 3 traps were empty, which wasn't unusual, but the 4th had been disturbed, not by an animal but by human hands. The trap was dismantled, its parts scattered across the snow. Silas's jaw tightened. Webb, how do you know? Because this is his style. Intimidation through sabotage. Make us think we're being watched, that we're vulnerable. He knelt in the snow, examining the scattered pieces. He was here yesterday, maybe the day before. Tracks are mostly filled in. Abigail's hand tightened on her rifle. What do? We reset the trap. We check the rest of the line. We don't let him intimidate us. But what if he's still out here? What if he's watching now? Then he sees we're not afraid. Silas's voice was steady, but Abigail could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the tree line. He was afraid, just better at hiding it. They spent the next 2 hours checking the remaining traps. 3 more had been sabotaged, all in the same way, dismantled and scattered. It was a clear message. Webb could reach them anywhere, could disrupt their livelihood, could make their lives difficult without ever showing himself. By the time they rode back to the cabin, the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping fast. Storm's breath steamed in the frigid air. Abigail's fingers were numb inside her mittens, her face raw from the cold wind. Inside the cabin, Silas immediately began checking weapons again. His movements were sharp, controlled anger radiating from him. This can't continue. If he keeps sabotaging the lines, we won't have enough pelts to trade come spring. We need that income to buy supplies for next winter. So what do we do? Abigail asked, though she dreaded the answer. We confront him, go to his camp at Black Rock Creek, and make it clear his harassment stops now. When? Tomorrow, while we still have daylight and the weather's clear. That night, Abigail lay awake in the loft, fear churning in her stomach. Confronting Webb felt like stepping into a wolf's den. But Silas was right. They couldn't continue like this, always looking over their shoulders, always waiting for the next act of sabotage. She thought about Sarah, about the woman who'd been ground down by cruelty until she couldn't bear it anymore. Abigail refused to let that be her story. Refused to let fear and harassment drive her into darkness. She'd survived too much, come too far, grown too strong to surrender now. Morning came cold and clear. They armed themselves heavily, rifles, pistols, knives, dressed in layers against the brutal cold. Silas gave Abigail careful instructions. If things go wrong, you ride hard back to the cabin. Bar the door and don't open it for anyone but me. If I'm not back by nightfall, you ride down to the settlement and get Crawford. Understand? Abigail nodded, though the thought of leaving him behind made her stomach turn. They rode out together, following the creek downstream toward Black Rock Creek. The forest was silent except for the crunch of Storm's hooves in the snow and the distant cry of a raven. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound could be an ambush. Black Rock Creek was a smaller valley about 5 miles from Silas's cabin, sheltered by high rock walls and fed by a spring that ran warm year-round. It was good trapping territory, which made it a coveted location. Webb had claimed it by force, driving out the previous occupant through intimidation and threats. They smelled the camp before they saw it, wood smoke and curing hides and unwashed men. Then the clearing came into view. 3 rough shelters built against the rock wall, a large fire pit, pelts hanging from makeshift racks, and 3 men standing near the fire, waiting. They knew we were coming. Silas's voice was grim. This was a trap, or at least a test. Webb wanted this confrontation. Too late to turn back now. They rode into the clearing, both tense and ready for violence. Webb stepped forward, that same wide smile on his face. But his hand rested casually on the pistol at his belt. Silas Thorne, didn't expect to see you down this way. Something I can help you with? You've been sabotaging my trap lines, have I? Webb's expression was all innocence. That's a serious accusation. 3 traps dismantled in the last week. Your tracks all over my territory. Funny thing about tracks in snow, they all look the same after a while. Hard to prove who made them. Silas dismounted in one fluid motion, his hand on his rifle. I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to make sure it stops. Or what? The challenge hung in the air between them. Webb's companions moved closer, flanking their leader. Abigail's hand tightened on her own rifle. The odds were bad, 3 against 2, and she was still learning to shoot. If this turned violent, they might not make it out. Or I go to Crawford and the Settlement Council. Lay out everything you've done, the threats, the sabotage, the intimidation. Let them decide if you're welcome in this territory anymore. Webb's smile finally faded. His eyes went cold and hard. You'd bring the council into this? Over a few traps? Over harassment of my wife and interference with our livelihood? Yes, Abigail's heart swelled at that. My wife, not my burden, not my responsibility, but my wife. Equal partner in this confrontation. Webb studied them for a long moment. Then he laughed, but there was no humor in it. You've got stones, Thorne, I'll give you that. Coming here, outnumbered. Making threats, not threats. Promises. Fine. Webb held up his hands in mock surrender. Your trap lines are safe. No more interference. We'll all just be friendly neighbors out here in the wilderness. The words were right, but his tone wasn't. This wasn't over. He was backing down for now, but the threat remained. Glad we understand each other. Silas remounted Storm without taking his eyes off Webb. They began to back the horse toward the edge of the clearing, never turning their backs on the 3 men. Just one thing, Thorne. Webb's voice stopped them at the tree line. Winter's long. Lots of things can happen in winter. Accidents, misunderstandings. A man can't watch his back every minute of every day. The threat was clear. Abigail felt ice slide down her spine. Then it's good I don't have to watch alone. Silas glanced at Abigail as he said it, pride evident in his expression. She sat straighter in the saddle, meeting Webb's cold gaze with one of her own. She wasn't the frightened girl from the gathering anymore. She was a woman who could handle a rifle, who could survive the mountains, who wouldn't back down from threats. They rode away from the camp, moving quickly but not running. Only when they were well out of sight did Silas let out a long breath. That went better than I feared. Better? We're still in danger. True, but we made our position clear. Webb knows we won't be easy victims and that we have allies in the settlement. That might be enough to make him look for easier prey. Might? Silas's expression was grim. With men like Webb, you never know. But we did what we could. Now we stay alert and hope for the best. They rode back to the cabin in tense silence. The confrontation had bought them time, but at what cost? Webb now knew they were willing to fight, which could either deter him or escalate the situation. That night, Silas reinforced the cabin's defenses. He set up a simple alarm system. Bells hung on thin wires around the perimeter, hidden in the snow but ready to ring if anyone approached. Not foolproof, but better than nothing. Abigail watched him work, her mind churning. She'd never imagined her new life would involve this kind of danger. She'd thought the mountains would be harsh but honest, cold in hunger and hard work, yes, but not human malice, not threats and sabotage, and the constant fear of violence. But maybe that was naive. Cruelty existed everywhere, in the settlement with its mockery, and in the wilderness with men like Webb. The difference was that here, she wasn't facing it alone. The weeks that followed were nerve-wracking but uneventful. No more sabotage. No visits from Webb, just the steady progression of winter and the constant work of survival. But the threat hung over them like a storm cloud, always present even when not actively raining down. Abigail threw herself into learning everything Silas could teach her. She practiced with the rifle until she could hit targets at 100 yards. Learned to track animals through the snow by reading their prints and droppings. Studied the plants and herbs that could be used for medicine. Became proficient at tanning hides and preserving meat. She was becoming what these mountains demanded. Tough, skilled, resilient. And in becoming that, she was also becoming herself in ways she'd never been allowed to before. One night, nearly 4 months after the gathering, Abigail sat by the fire repairing a torn coat. Her stitches were neat, and even now, the result of countless hours of practice. Silas sat across from her, working on a new pair of snowshoes. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up. "Do you still see Sarah when you look at me?" The question had been building in her for weeks. She needed to know if he still thought of her as a replacement, a second chance to save someone he'd failed to protect. Silas set down the snowshoes. His gray eyes were thoughtful. "At first, yes. That's what drove me to choose you, seeing her pain reflected in you. But no, not anymore. What changed? You did. You became yourself, not an echo of someone else. Sarah was gentle, sweet, fragile in a way the mountains couldn't accommodate. You're different. You're strong. You adapt. You fight." He paused. "She would have liked you, I think. Would have been glad I found someone who could survive what she couldn't." The words settled over Abigail like a warm blanket. She wasn't a replacement. She was her own person, valued for who she was rather than who she reminded him of. "I miss her," Silas continued. "I probably always will, but I'm not trying to bring her back through you. You're your own woman, Abigail, and you're remarkable." Her throat tightened with emotion. "Thank you for saying that. It's the truth." They returned to their work, but the air between them felt different. Lighter somehow, as if a weight they'd both been carrying had finally been set down. That night, lying in the loft, Abigail thought about the journey she'd been on. 4 months ago, she'd stood on that platform convinced she was worthless, convinced no one would ever want her, convinced her life would be nothing but mockery and shame. Now she lay in a cabin high in the mountains, married to a man who saw her strength, surrounded by evidence of her own capabilities. She'd learned to shoot, to track, to survive. She'd faced threats and stood her ground. She'd claimed space in the world and refused to apologize for it. The girl who'd stumbled on that platform was gone. In her place was a woman who could face whatever came next with courage and determination. And whatever came next, she suspected, would involve Marcus Webb. The threat hadn't disappeared. It had only gone quiet, waiting for the right moment to strike. But when it did, Abigail would be ready. Spring came late to the high country, but when it finally arrived, it brought new dangers along with the melting snow. The trap lines needed constant attention now as animals emerged from their winter dens. The garden plot needed preparation for planting. The cabin roof needed repair where ice had damaged the shingles. Silas and Abigail worked from dawn until dark, making up for lost time. The threat from Webb had faded into background worry rather than immediate fear. No sabotage in months, no visits, no signs of trouble. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made Abigail more nervous. Men like Webb didn't simply give up and move on. They waited for opportunities. One morning in early April, Silas announced he needed to ride down to the settlement for spring supplies. Seeds for planting, salt for preserving meat, ammunition to replace what they'd used during the winter. The trip would take most of the day. "You're not coming with me this time," Abigail looked up from the bread dough she was kneading. Why not? Because someone needs to stay and watch the cabin. And because I need you to check the southern trap line while I'm gone, we can't afford to let them sit another day. Alone, you're ready. You know the route, you know how to reset the traps, and you can shoot straight if you need to. He met her eyes. I trust you. Those 3 words meant more than any lengthy speech could have. He trusted her, saw her as capable, competent, equal to the task. All right, I'll check the southern line. Silas left just after dawn, Storm carrying him down the mountain trail. Abigail watched until he disappeared into the trees, then turned to face her day alone. The cabin suddenly felt very empty, very isolated. She pushed the feeling aside. She had work to do. After finishing the morning chores, feeding chickens, hauling water, banking the fire, she set out for the southern trap line. It ran through a narrow valley about a mile from the cabin, following a creek where beaver built their dams. Silas had shown her the route twice, made her memorize landmarks, taught her to read the terrain. She moved confidently through the forest, rifle slung across her back, knife at her belt. The spring air was cool but pleasant, filled with the sound of running water and birdsong. New growth pushed up through the melting snow, green shoots and tiny flowers that would soon carpet the forest floor. The first 3 traps were empty but intact. She reset them carefully, exactly as Silas had taught her. The 4th trap held a beaver, freshly caught, its pelt prime and valuable. She dispatched it quickly, mercifully, and began the process of removing it from the trap. That's when she heard the horses. 3 riders emerged from the trees on the far side of the creek. Abigail's heart lurched into her throat. She recognized them immediately. Marcus Webb and his 2 companions. Well, well, look who's out here all alone. Webb's voice carried across the rushing water. His smile was wide, but his eyes were cold. Abigail's hand moved slowly toward her rifle. Where's Thorn? Gone to the settlement. She kept her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. He'll be back before dark. That's so? That's interesting, because I saw him heading down the mountain trail not 2 hours ago. Looked like he had a heavy load to carry. Might be gone longer than expected. The implication was clear. They'd been watching, waiting for exactly this opportunity. Silas gone, Abigail alone and vulnerable. I need to get back to the cabin. She started to move, but Webb's companions urged their horses forward, cutting off her retreat. Not so fast. We came all this way to have a conversation. Seems rude to run off before we've had a chance to talk. Abigail's hand closed around her rifle. She pulled it around in one smooth motion, the way Silas had taught her, and aimed it directly at Webb's chest. The conversation's over. For the first time, Webb's smile faltered. He held up his hands, but the gesture was mocking rather than surrendering. Now, there's no call for that. We're just being neighborly. You dismantled our traps, threatened us. That's not neighborly, ancient history. We're past that now. Webb's horse took a step closer, and Abigail adjusted her aim to follow. I'm here with a business proposition. Not interested. Hear me out. You're a smart woman, smarter than Thorn gives you credit for, I'd wager. You see, winter was hard. My trapping didn't go as well as I'd hoped. But Thorn's territory, his cabin, that's prime land, worth a lot to the right buyer. He's not selling, maybe not to me. But what if something happened? What if Thorn had an accident out there in the wilderness? His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. A widow all alone might be persuaded to sell, especially if she had the right encouragement. Abigail's blood ran cold. He was threatening to kill Silas, threatening to force her into selling the land. The casual way he discussed murder made her realize just how dangerous this man truly was. Touch him, and I'll kill you. The words came out steady and sure. Webb laughed. You? You couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. Abigail pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder. The bullet struck the rock face behind Webb, exactly where she'd aimed it, close enough to make her point, far enough to avoid murder charges. The horses reared. Webb's companions fought to control their mounts. Webb himself went pale, his easy confidence shattered. Next one goes through your chest. Get off our land. Her hands were steady on the rifle as she chambered another round. The click was loud in the sudden silence. Webb stared at her, reassessing, realizing he'd badly miscalculated. You're making a mistake. No, you made the mistake. Thinking I was weak, thinking I'd be easy to intimidate. She took a step forward, rifle still aimed. This is your only warning. Stay away from us. Stay away from our land. Next time I see you, I shoot first. Webb's jaw tightened. He jerked his horse's reins, turning the animal sharply. His companions followed suit, but before disappearing into the trees, he looked back one final time. Thorne's got more enemies than just me out here. You remember that when things go wrong? Then they were gone, crashing through the underbrush in their haste to leave. Abigail stood frozen for a long moment, rifle still raised, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Then her hands started shaking. Her legs went weak. She sank to her knees in the mud beside the creek, the rifle clutched to her chest. She'd done it. She'd stood up to Webb, driven him off, protected herself and Silas. But the cost was high. They'd made a powerful enemy, and Webb's parting words suggested there were others like him out here, other men who saw their land as something to be taken. After several minutes, she forced herself to stand. She retrieved the beaver from the trap, slung it over her shoulder, and began the long walk back to the cabin. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat now. Every sound made her jump, but she made it back safely. Once inside, she barred the door and checked every weapon, making sure they were loaded and ready. Then she settled near the window with the rifle across her lap and waited for Silas to return. The sun crawled across the sky with agonizing slowness. Hours passed. Abigail's mind conjured 100 terrible scenarios. Silas ambushed on the trail, Webb circling back with reinforcements, the cabin surrounded. But when hoofbeats finally sounded on the trail, it was Silas alone, storm-laden with supplies. Abigail threw open the door and ran to meet him. He took one look at her face and was off the horse in an instant. What happened? Webb came, while you were gone, threatened us, threatened you, tried to force me to agree to sell the land after he killed you. Silas's expression went dark and dangerous. She'd never seen him look like that before, like barely controlled violence ready to explode. Did he touch you? No, I shot at him, drove him off. You shot at him? Abigail nodded, and to her surprise, Silas pulled her into a fierce embrace. His arms wrapped around her, solid and warm, and she felt some of the fear that had been coiled tight in her chest finally begin to ease. You did exactly right. His voice was rough with emotion. You protected yourself, protected our home. I'm proud of you. He said there are others, other men who want our land. Silas pulled back, his hands on her shoulders, his gray eyes intense. Then we make sure they know what happened today. Make sure they know you're not defenseless, that we're not easy targets. He paused. But first, we need to report this to Crawford and the Settlement Council. Webb threatened murder. That's beyond simple harassment. The next morning, they rode down to the settlement together, both armed, both alert. The square was busy with spring activity, traders arriving with goods from the lower valleys, families preparing their gardens, children playing in the muddy streets after months of being trapped inside by snow. Tobias Crawford listened to their story with a grave expression. When Abigail described firing the warning shot, his bushy eyebrows rose. You faced down Webb and two of his men, alone. It was him or us. Crawford nodded slowly. Webb's been trouble for years, but this crosses a line. Threatening murder for land, that's beyond what we tolerate here. He stood and called for several other men, leaders in the settlement. Within an hour, they'd assembled an informal council. The decision was swift and unanimous. Marcus Webb was banned from the territory. He had 1 week to pack his camp and leave. If he was found in the area after that, he'd be arrested and tried for his threats. 2 of Crawford's sons and 3 other armed men rode out immediately to deliver the message. Silas and Abigail stayed in the settlement, waiting to see if Webb would cause trouble. He didn't. 3 days later, word came back that Webb and his companions had packed up and left, heading south toward Colorado territory. The threat was over, but the experience had changed something in Abigail. She'd proven to herself that she could face danger, could protect what was hers, could survive without Silas there to shield her. That knowledge settled into her bones, became part of who she was. The settlement noticed too. The whispers had changed from mockery to respect. People nodded to her when she passed. Women asked her advice about preparing for winter. Men treated her like an equal rather than a curiosity. One afternoon, while Silas was negotiating the sale of their winter pelts, a group of women approached Abigail near the provision store. She recognized them, Margaret and Catherine, her stepsisters, along with Louisa and Eleanor Crawford. Abigail. Margaret's voice was uncertain, almost shy. We heard what happened. With Webb, news travels fast. It does. Catherine stepped forward. We wanted to say, that is, we're sorry for how we treated you before. At the gathering and before that. Abigail studied them, these women who'd watched her be mocked and never said a word in her defense. Part of her wanted to reject their apology, to hold on to the hurt they'd caused. But another part, the part that had grown strong in the mountains, understood that holding on to pain only gave it power over you. Thank you for saying that, Eleanor Crawford spoke up, her voice earnest. You're an inspiration to us. Truly, you prove that a woman can be more than just pretty and graceful. That strength comes in different forms. We were taught to mock anything different. Louisa's cheeks were flushed, to compete with each other instead of supporting each other. But you showed us something different is possible. The words touched something in Abigail's heart. These women weren't her enemies anymore. They were just people, flawed and trying, shaped by the same harsh world that had shaped her. We all do what we must to survive. Some of us just take longer to figure out what that means. The women nodded, and something passed between them. Not quite friendship, but understanding. A beginning, perhaps, of something better than what had existed before. That evening, as Silas and Abigail prepared to ride back up the mountain, Tobias Crawford stopped them. There's a spring gathering in 2 weeks, celebration of planting season. Music, dancing, food. He looked at Abigail. You should come. Both of you. Abigail's stomach clenched. The memory of the last gathering, the mockery, the humiliation, the laughter, was still fresh and painful despite everything that had happened since. I don't know if you should come. Crawford's voice was firm but kind. Show them who you've become. Show them that their cruelty didn't break you. He's right. Silas's voice surprised her. She turned to look at him. You faced Webb alone. You can face a gathering, but they'll laugh again. They'll let them try. His eyes were steady, confident. You're not the same woman who stood on that platform 5 months ago, and I think it's time everyone saw that. The ride back up the mountain was quiet. Abigail's mind churned with fear and anticipation. Part of her wanted to refuse, to stay safe in the cabin where no one could mock her. But another part, the part that had driven off Webb, the part that had learned to shoot and trap and survive, that part wanted to go back, wanted to face them, wanted to claim her victory. That night, lying in the loft, she made her decision. She would go to the gathering, not to prove anything to them, but to prove something to herself, that she could return to the place of her greatest humiliation and not be destroyed by it. The 2 weeks passed quickly. Spring work consumed their days, planting the garden, repairing winter damage, cleaning and organizing after months of being trapped inside. But underneath the routine, anticipation built like water behind a dam. The night before the gathering, Silas did something unexpected. He went to a chest in the corner of the cabin, the same one where he kept Sarah's journal, and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Sarah made this. Never got to wear it. He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a dress, deep green wool with delicate embroidery around the collar and cuffs. It was beautiful, finely made, clearly the work of someone with skill and patience. I can't wear your wife's dress. She would have wanted you to. He held it up. She made it for special occasions, for gatherings and celebrations. She'd be glad it was being used instead of sitting in a chest gathering dust. Abigail took the dress with trembling hands. It was the most beautiful piece of clothing she'd ever seen, let alone owned. The wool was soft, the embroidery intricate. Sarah had put love into every stitch. The next morning, Abigail dressed carefully. The green dress fit surprisingly well, only slightly loose in the waist. She braided her hair neatly and even pinned some early wildflowers into it at Silas's suggestion. When she looked at her reflection in the small mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman looking back was strong, confident, capable. Her face had lost the soft roundness of constant fear. Her eyes were clear and direct. Her shoulders were straight. This was a woman who could face anything. They rode down to the settlement together, both dressed in their best. The gathering was in full swing when they arrived. Music from fiddles and guitars, long tables laden with food, children running and playing, adults talking and laughing. Heads turned when they rode in. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The music faltered briefly before picking up again. Silas dismounted first, then helped Abigail down. This time, when his hands lingered on her waist, it felt natural. Right. They stood there for a moment, facing the gathering together. Ready? She took a deep breath. Ready. They walked into the crowd, and Abigail felt every eye on her. But this time, the weight of those stares felt different. There was surprise, yes, and speculation, but also a kind of grudging respect. She'd survived, more than survived. She'd thrived. And they could see it. They moved through the gathering, greeting people, accepting congratulations on driving Webb away. Abigail found herself actually enjoying conversations, no longer shrinking from attention, but meeting it head on. Then she saw him, her father, Warren, standing near one of the food tables with Constance. Their eyes met across the crowd. For a moment, neither moved. Then Warren nodded slowly, a gesture that held acknowledgement, if not quite approval. Abigail nodded back. They would probably never be close, would never recover the relationship they'd had before her mother died. But maybe that was okay. Maybe some bridges were meant to stay burned so you could move forward instead of back. The music swelled as the sun began to set. People moved toward the open space that served as a dance floor. Couples paired off, beginning to dance to a lively reel. Abigail felt her stomach tighten. Dancing. Of course there would be dancing. The memory of being mocked, of stumbling, of laughter, it all came rushing back. Silas must have sensed her tension because he turned to her, his expression gentle. You don't have to, I know, but I want to. The words surprised her even as she said them, but they were true. She wanted to reclaim this, wanted to dance not in secret in a cabin, but here in public, in front of everyone who'd mocked her. She wanted to prove that joy wasn't something she had to hide. Then dance with me. He offered his hand, that same gesture he'd made so many times. At the gathering, at the cabin, each time an offer of partnership rather than pity. She took it, her rough palm against his, and let him lead her toward the dance floor. People noticed. Of course they noticed. The music faltered slightly. Conversations died. Everyone turned to watch as Silas and Abigail stepped onto the dance floor. Abigail's heart hammered in her chest. Her palms were sweating. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to protect herself from the coming mockery. But Silas's hand was steady at her waist. His eyes were on hers, not on the crowd. Dance with me, not for them. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The music resumed, slower now, a waltz instead of a reel. Silas began to move, and she followed. Step by step, they moved together across the packed earth. This time, Abigail didn't stumble, didn't trip over her own feet. She moved with growing confidence, trusting Silas to lead, trusting herself to follow. The crowd was silent, watching, waiting for her to fail perhaps, or maybe just witnessing something they'd never expected to see, the girl they'd mocked dancing with grace and joy. Silas spun her gently, and Abigail let out a small laugh. The sound seemed to break some spell. Other couples began to join them on the dance floor. The music swelled. Life returned to the gathering. But Silas and Abigail remained at the center, moving together like they'd been doing this for years instead of months. His hand was warm against her back, her fingers curled around his shoulder. They moved as one, perfectly synchronized. You're beautiful when you smile. Silas's voice was quiet, meant only for her. Abigail looked up at him, startled. He'd never said anything like that before. Had carefully avoided any comment on her appearance, good or bad. Thank you, I mean it. You've always been beautiful, but now you believe it. That's what's different. The words settled warm in her chest, not because she needed him to find her beautiful, but because he saw beauty in her confidence, in her strength, in the person she'd become. The music slowed, winding toward its end. Silas pulled her closer, his arms encircling her in a way that felt protective but also tender. Around them, other couples danced, but Abigail was aware only of him, his warmth, his strength, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. The final notes faded into silence. Applause rippled through the gathering, but it wasn't mocking. It was genuine appreciation for the music, for the moment, for the transformation they'd all witnessed. Silas and Abigail stepped apart, but his hand remained on her waist, steadying her. She looked around at the faces watching them and saw surprise, respect, even admiration. These were the same people who'd laughed at her 5 months ago, but they weren't laughing now. Tobias Crawford approached, a smile creasing his weathered face. That was well done. Both of you. Thank you for inviting us. Abigail's voice was steady, confident. She wasn't the frightened girl who'd stood on the platform anymore. She was a woman who'd claimed her place in this harsh world and refused to apologize for it. The gathering continued around them, more dancing, more music, more food and conversation. Silas and Abigail moved through it all together, no longer outsiders, but part of the community. People approached to congratulate them, to welcome them back, to acknowledge the journey they'd made. As the evening wore on, Louisa found Abigail near the food tables. Her stepsister's face was earnest, almost pleading. Can I speak with you? Alone? Abigail nodded, and they moved away from the crowd into the shadows at the edge of the gathering. I need to tell you something. Louisa's voice was barely above a whisper. That day at the gathering, when they mocked you, I wanted to stop them. Wanted to say something, but I was too afraid of being mocked myself, I know. Fear makes us do things we regret. I've thought about it every day since. Thought about how I failed you when you needed someone to stand up for you. Tears glittered in Louisa's eyes. I'm so sorry. I should have been braver. You're being brave now. That's what matters. Louisa wiped at her eyes. You're different, stronger, but also kinder than I'd be if I were in your place. I'm not kind. I'm just tired of holding on to pain. It doesn't serve me anymore. The words were true. Abigail had carried her pain for so long, let it define her, shape her. But in the mountains, working beside Silas, building a life from nothing, she'd learned that pain was a choice. She could hold on to it or she could let it go. And letting go meant freedom. Louisa hugged her impulsively. Thank you for showing us what real strength looks like. After her stepsister left, Abigail stood alone for a moment, looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that shone over the cabin, over the mountains, over this vast territory where she'd found herself. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Silas approaching. Ready to go home? Home. The words settled warm in her chest. Yes, let's go home. They made their farewells and mounted Storm together. The gathering continued behind them as they rode up the trail toward the mountains, toward their cabin, toward the life they'd built together. The ride was quiet, comfortable. Abigail's arms wrapped around Silas's waist, her cheek resting against his back. She felt peaceful in a way she'd never experienced before, as if all the broken pieces of herself had finally been put back together. When they reached the cabin, Silas helped her down from the horse. But instead of releasing her immediately, his hands lingered on her waist. He looked down at her, his gray eyes reflecting starlight. Thank you for coming tonight, for being brave. Thank you for giving me a reason to be brave. He smiled, that rare full smile that transformed his face. You always had that reason. You just needed time to find it. They stood like that for a long moment, the space between them charged with possibility. Then Silas leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't want to. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle, tentative, asking rather than demanding. Abigail kissed him back, her hands moving to his shoulders, anchoring herself to this moment, this man, this life she'd claimed for herself. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Silas rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Abigail. Not because you remind me of Sarah, not because I needed to save you, but because of who you are. Your strength, your kindness, your courage, all of it. The words wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. I love you too. It was the truth. Somewhere between learning to shoot and facing down Webb, Between quiet evenings by the fire and dancing under the stars, she'd fallen in love with this quiet, patient man who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. They went inside together, and for the first time, Abigail didn't climb to the loft alone. They lay together on the furs by the fire, wrapped in each other's arms, talking quietly about the future, about plans for the summer and the next winter, about the life they would build together. And in the darkness, with Silas's heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Abigail finally understood what her mother had meant all those years ago. Strength came in different forms. It came in the ability to keep going when everything hurt, in the courage to be kind when the world was cruel, in the power to choose love over fear, growth over stagnation, life over mere survival. She'd survived the mockery and the shame. She'd survived the wilderness and the threats. She'd survived everything the world had thrown at her. And in surviving, she'd discovered who she truly was. Not the burden her father had seen, not the joke the settlement had made her, but a woman of strength and capability and worth. A woman who could face anything and come out stronger on the other side. The fire burned low. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines. And in the cabin, two people who'd found each other in the midst of hardship slept peacefully, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together.